Chapter 31. For the first time in decades, an accomplished immortal master from the Thousand Autumns sect took a fancy to a young man in Qingshitang village. After the young man paid the fee and passed the mirror of immortality, the immortal master from the Thousand Autumns sect was right. This young man was gifted and was accepted as a personal disciple. When the news spread, Qingshitang village was in an uproar. Everyone spread the news. Countless people were envious and jealous. The luckiest young man was the man of the hour in the village, the suave young master Li Ji. In today's world, entering an immortal sect was like a carp leaping through the dragon's gate. From then on, one's life would be completely different. The young man who was smiling warmly and painting for the girls by the stream yesterday was now like a god standing high above the clouds, looking down on all living things. No one could get close to him anymore. As a result, the women in the village often sighed with regret. There were also people who carefully mounted their old pictures and hung them on the wall to look at them every day, treating them as memories that they could recall for the rest of their lives. As for more wishful thinking, no one really thought about it. Occasionally, when they gathered together to talk about young Master Li, they would laugh and argue that he was nicer to them back then. The weather was getting hotter and fewer people came to drink. Business in Old Ma's tavern was very bleak. Most of the time, only Lu Qin, who ate and drank for free, came to his tavern. This made Old Ma's mood not very good. In addition, he had not cultivated to the point where he was immune to heat and cold. As a fatty, it was especially easy for him to sweat on hot days, so he was a little irritated. On this day, Old Ma looked at the only customer in his tavern. He was getting more and more annoyed. He said to Lu Qin, "Hey, you already owe me a big debt and you still have the nerve to come here and eat for free?" Lu Qin laughed and drank the wine in his glass in one gulp. Then he leaned against the table and said to Old Ma with a smile, "Nowadays, the one who owes the debt is the boss. Don't you know?" Bah. Old Ma spat at him and then wiped the sweat on his forehead with the towel beside him. He walked to the table opposite Lu Qin and sat down. He looked out of the window at the village where the sun was shining brightly and sighed, "Look at the people outside. They work themselves to death from day to night. What's the point of it? Look at that Li Ji. He hasn't been here for long, but he's already in the Thousand Autumns gate. People really can't be compared." Lu Qin shook his head and said, "Aren't you being sarcastic? People who have nothing and want to cultivate are all like this." Old Ma clicked his tongue, but he did not refute Lu Qin's words. He merely shook his head and said, "That Li Ji fellow is really lucky." Lu Qin quietly looked at an unknown direction in the distance outside the window. After staring silently for a while, he turned his head and said to Old Ma, "This is just a chance for that person. There's nothing to care about. But the matter of the evil sect pattern, you still can't find any clues?" Old Ma heard this and scratched his head in distress. He bitterly smiled and said, "Yes." Lu Qin snorted and said, "That pattern can't be carved there for no reason. Something must have happened in this village. Be more careful." Old Ma sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know. I've secretly searched this village many times, but I really can't find anyone suspicious. It's like I've seen a ghost. Those evildoers from the evil sect must be too bored. They just drew a pattern and ran away." Lu Qin was silent. After a while, he placed the wine cup on the table and stood up. He said, "I'm going back." By the Qingshui stream, the green bamboos were still green, but the peach blossoms had already withered. It looked a little lonely. Under the blazing hot sun, there were very few people walking on the green stone path. Lu Qin walked along the side of the stream. Just as he was about to walk past the stone bridge, he suddenly saw a familiar figure walking over from the other side of the stream. It was Ding Dang. Lu Qin stopped walking. Ding Dang, who was standing on the stone bridge, also saw Lu Qin. Her face flashed a trace of astonishment. She then smiled and greeted him, but her smile was somewhat forced. The two of them walked to the shade of the green bamboos to talk. Ding Dang looked a little uneasy, but she quickly smiled and said to Lu Qin, "It's been a while." Lu Qin sized her up and nodded his head. "Yes, I haven't seen you in a while. Where did you go?" Ding Dang said, "No, I'm suffering from the summer. I hate this hot weather the most, so I don't like to go out." Lu Qin nodded his head and replied. Then the two of them sank into silence. After a while, perhaps feeling a little awkward, Ding Dang pursed her lips and said, "That? I owe you spirit stones. You will have to wait a little longer. I will return it to you soon." Lu Qin said, "No worries, I don't have anything urgent." Ding Dang looked like she was relieved and her mood was much better. She actually stuck out her tongue and said with a smile, "Don't worry, I will definitely not renege on my debt. I said I will return it to you and I will definitely return it to you." Moreover, when the opportunity comes, I will also bestow you with a heavenly fortune. Heavenly fortune? Lu Chen raised his eyes and looked at Ding Dang. Ding Dang smiled sweetly and nodded her head heavily. She was in high spirits as if she already had power in her hands and the confidence to control other people's lives. Deep into the night at the foot of Tea Mountain, the heat of the day had completely dissipated. What replaced it was a cool and refreshing cold wind that blew down from the mountain. Those strange sounds that sounded like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves sounded out once again. It was like a ghost palace in hell, causing one's heart to palpitate. The grass hut at the foot of the mountain stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the endless night. The grass hut was silent. The doors and windows were tightly shut. Although it could not block out the strange sounds, it was still like a strange little world. There was no one in the hut. In the darkness, one could not even hear the sound of breathing. One could only see a blurry shadow and an overturned bedboard. In the mysterious space of the tree hole, Lu Chen sat on the ground. He looked at the light green puddle in front of him with a serious expression. He looked solemn. His eyebrows were tightly knitted as if he was deep in thought. It was as if there was something he was hesitating about. Around him, the tree hole was quiet. The gray chi wrapped around the ancient tree walls were like gentle water ripples, gently flowing and undulating. After an unknown period of time, suddenly, Lu Chen's eyes opened, as if he had finally hardened his heart and made a decision. He took a deep breath, and a strange black light flashed across his face. A moment later, there was a faint glimmer of light coming from his lower abdomen, which was the most important place for all cultivators, the Dantian and the Sea of Qi. Chapter 32. The Dantian Sea of Qi was the most vital point for all cultivators who cultivated the immortal Tao. But for Lu Chen, the terrifying black fire from 10 years ago was like a bone piercing all that had completely destroyed his foundation. He could neither live nor die, and he had repeatedly suffered the terrible pain of being burned by the black fire. This was also the first time in 10 years that he actively stimulated the qi in his dantian. From another point of view, this was equivalent to him actively activating the black flame curse. Sure enough, just as he tried to activate the qi in his dantian, when his completely damaged 5 elements disc trembled slightly and was about to take shape, a demonic black fire suddenly rolled up from the bottom of the disc, emerging from the depths of every hideous crack and wound, like the silent but terrifying laughter of an evil spirit. The black fire instantly spread throughout his Dantian Sea of Qi, and then rushed out in all directions. The black fire burned his body. Lu Chen roared in pain, and the black fire crazily penetrated through many corners of his skin. His flesh trembled, and instantly turned into terrible scorched earth. However, this time, Lu Chen didn't directly throw himself into the only light green puddle that could save him like he did in the past. With unimaginable willpower, he forcefully sat upright on the spot, forcefully enduring all of the pain. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the puddle before him. His face was reflected in the water, like an evil spirit burning with black fire. Even his eyes seemed to be burning with black flames at this moment. Lu Chen groaned, the muscles on his face twisting, and then suddenly in his Dantian Sea of Qi, the damaged 5 elements disc seemed to be activated by some kind of power and began to slowly rotate. Every time it spun, Lu Chen's entire body seemed to tremble once. The black flames were like an enraged demon. With a loud rumble, they surged forward with incomparable ferocity, completely engulfing the damaged divine disc phantom. Everything seemed to be on the verge of being incinerated by this terrifying black fire, including his flesh, blood, and soul. The water in the nearby puddle was calm, but it was like the world's greatest temptation, quietly lying in front of Lu Chen. There were a few times when Lu Chen's body couldn't help but lean forward, wishing that he could roll into the icy cold water just like he did in the past. But for some reason he still endured. He howled in the terrible black fire. At this moment there seemed to be not an inch of his body that was intact, and even his face looked somewhat deformed. But in the black fire there was still a light, although weak, still flickering. That light came from his dantian, the 5 elements disc that was damaged to the extreme, burned by countless black flames. Even if it looked like it was about to collapse in the next moment, about to break into pieces and be completely destroyed, until now this 5 elements disc was unusually tenacious, that white light still didn't extinguish. All of a sudden, all of the black flames on Lu Chen's body shrank back into his body. They traveled through his meridians and meridians like lightning and rushed back to his dantian. Like a tsunami, they crazily rushed towards the 5 elements divine disc. That place, was the final foundation of Lu Chen's flesh and soul, and also the fundamental place where the black fire curse resided. As if in this silent world, suddenly there was an earth-shattering sound, and in an instant, all the black fire wrapped around the disc shone brightly, the black light engulfing everything. Lu Chen screamed in pain. In his dantian, that light dimmed, and the five elements disc finally couldn't resist this terrible curse, collapsing piece by piece, just like his body and soul on the verge of dispersing. In this split second suddenly Lu Chen roared. His right hand suddenly turned over, a bright light appeared, and a black and incomparably sharp dagger suddenly appeared in his hand. At this moment, his face was as cold as ice, not even the slightest emotion could be seen. With a flip of his hand, he directly stabbed this black dagger into his lower abdomen. His charred abdomen split open in an instant, and he howled to the sky. Then, his left hand formed a claw, and suddenly stabbed it into his dantian. At the same time, the last of his remaining strength was frantically circulating. That badly damaged five elements disc trembled as it welcomed the attack. He grabbed it as if he was holding his own heart and slowly pulled it out. The black fire burned crazily, rolling, and was about to sweep up along his wrist, but Lu Chen suddenly sank his hand, and the next moment his entire left hand sank into that pool of blue water. An incomparably dense life force surged over from all directions, surrounding the black flame. The black flame slowly left his palm, but it did not extinguish. It was still burning fiercely under the water, but it was gradually trapped in a wave of water. Lu Chen's body trembled violently. No one, especially a person whose physique was almost the same as an ordinary person, could withstand such a heavy injury. Right now there was no trace of blood on his face. He slowly lowered his head, his body powerlessly fell forward. With a roll, he also fell into that pool of blue water. With a voila sound, a splash of water slowly fell down. Then everything returned to tranquility, and there was no longer any sound. It was quiet in the tree hole, as if time had stopped here. One could faintly see the mysterious old rings on the ancient tree walls. It was unknown how many years had passed under the crisscross scars, but they were quickly covered by the gray aura. Crash! Suddenly a burst of water sound broke the silence here. Lu Chen suddenly sat up from the water, and then with great difficulty slowly climbed out. Just like before, the black fire burns on his body once again miraculously disappeared, including the wound on his abdomen. And this pool of blue water was like the legendary water of immortality, time and time again pulled him back from the brink of death. But just as he climbed to the ground, gasping for breath, when he accidentally turned his head, suddenly Lu Chen's body shook as if he saw something shocking. He was dumbfounded. In the small pool of blue water beside him, the dark green color that symbolized the unimaginably rich life force, completely disappeared. At this moment the puddle looked like an ordinary little pond. Lu Chen was stunned for a while. After a while he slowly stood up, suddenly saw that under the clear water, there seemed to be a black shadow in the water. Chapter 33. Lu Chen was taken aback. He looked carefully and saw that in the depths of the water, there was a ball of water that was much more solid than its surroundings. It actually formed a round ball of water that floated motionlessly in the water. And in the center of the transparent ball of water, a small black flame was silently burning. Lu Chen silently looked at the small black flame and suddenly smiled bitterly. He didn't know why, but he strangely felt a sense of familiarity. At this moment his whole body was powerless and incomparably weak. He slowly took a few steps back and then fell to the ground. After catching his breath for a moment, he sat down cross-legged and used his divine sense to examine his body. Under the nourishment of the mystical water of life, the terrifying wound in his dantian had actually healed. It looked empty, as if nothing had happened. Everything seemed to be starting over again. Lu Chen sat quietly. After a while, suddenly in his dantian, a breath emerged. Then, like a miracle in his dantian, a shadow flashed and a brand new, almost intact five elements disc gradually floated up. A look of disbelief and ecstasy flashed across Lu Chen's face. But then he was startled. On the five elements disc, everything was like a newborn baby. There seemed to be nothing. It was far from the outstanding talent he had in the past. At this moment, the five elements divine disc was completely barren. Only at the center of the disc, in the position of the earth element, was a yellow divine pillar that was the lightest in color. It was only about an inch tall, and it stood alone in the center of the disc. Among all the cultivators in the world, this was the situation of having the worst aptitude and the worst foundation of cultivating the Tao. Lu Chen was silent for a while, then he shook his head and smiled bitterly, but he didn't seem too disappointed. Just when he was about to leave, the 5 elements divine plate suddenly trembled, and actually flipped over. The entire plate was flipped over. Lu Chen's face suddenly froze. The other side of the 5 elements divine disc, the other side of the 5 elements divine disc that no one had ever heard of before, was completely empty. Apart from a vast expanse of black, not even a blade of grass could be seen. In the center of this strange black divine disc, a tiny black flame was silently burning in the center of the divine disc. It was like the grin of a devil, slowly opening its mouth full of malicious fangs at Lu Chen. What the hell is this weather? A curse came from the tavern. Old Ma was sitting in his own tavern, wearing only a pair of underpants. His upper body was bare, revealing his white fat. He held a towel in his hand and kept wiping his face, wiping away the beads of sweat that kept oozing out. His mouth was also constantly muttering. Sitting opposite him, Lu Chen also looked a little listless. He lazily glanced at the fat man, frowned, and said with a look of disgust, "Is there anyone who does business like you? Dressed like this in broad daylight, who would dare to come and drink?" Old Ma snorted and said, "In this kind of damned weather, even cicadas can be roasted on such a hot day. Who would come here to drink?" Lu Chen didn't deny it but didn't refute him. He just looked at the glass of wine on the table in front of him. Today's weather had become a little strange since the beginning of summer. It was much hotter than in previous years. According to the elders in the village, it had not been such a hot summer in at least 30 years. Perhaps something was going to happen when the weather changed. This was the long-winded words of those old men who pretended to be mysterious. But obviously, no one believed this kind of baseless words, and there was indeed no other abnormality except for a little hotter. Lu Chen opened his mouth and yawned. He leaned against the wall and slightly narrowed his eyes, looking a little sleepy. Old Ma wiped his sweat again, and then looked at Lu Chen with some envy, who didn't sweat at all on such a hot day. After a moment he suddenly frowned and came over. Lu Chen immediately opened his eyes and said, "What are you doing?" Old Ma looked at him and whispered, "Young man, I feel that your body seems to be very weak. Did you overdo it? Listen to my advice. Young people should take care of their body, don't wait." Before he could finish his words, Old Ma leaped backward and dodged a black foot from under the table with an agility that did not match his figure at all. He laughed and said, hurry up, you have a guilty conscience." "Guilty my ass." Lu Chen unhappily rolled his eyes at him. Old Ma laughed and used a towel to wipe his face. He walked back and sat down and then casually said, "Speaking of this, I feel that you haven't been looking for Ding Dang recently?" Lu Chen coldly laughed and said, "I'm tired of playing, I don't want to play anymore, okay?" Yes. Old Ma grinned and then raised his head to look at the big sun outside. His face became dejected and he muttered, "Why is the weather so hot?" Lu Chen drank a mouthful of wine and was silent for a moment. He suddenly said, "That's right, that Li Ji who was accepted into the Thousand Autumn sect a few days ago, how is he doing?" Old Ma snorted and said, "It's not like I know everything. What does the cultivation sect's matters have to do with this village?" Lu Chen laughed and only looked at Old Ma. Old Ma's mouth twitched, then he lightly said, "That bastard's talent is really not bad. I heard that after he entered the sect, he quickly won the favor of one of the Thousand Autumn sect's elders and is prepared to accept him as a disciple. His future is bright." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Sounds good." Old Ma said, "A sparrow flying on a branch turns into a phoenix." Lu Chen said, "Then has he ever returned to Qingshitang village?" Old Ma laughed and said, "Of course not. With his current status, who cares about this broken village?" Lu Chen thought about it and said, "You're right." Boom. Suddenly, a loud noise came from outside the tavern like a bolt from the blue. Moreover, the sound seemed to have come from the sky above the village. Lu Chen and Old Ma were both shocked. They looked at each other, then stood up and ran out of the tavern at the same time. At the same time, when they ran out of the gate, they saw many people in the surrounding houses running out as well. Obviously, they were all alarmed by the sudden loud noise. At this moment, many people in Qingshitang village looked up at the same time. The sky was clear and the sun was high in the sky. There were no clouds in the sky and it looked like a hot day. Not to mention the usual dark clouds during thunder, there were not even a few white clouds. What was going on? Chapter 34. Just when everyone was astonished, someone suddenly cried out in surprise and pointed to a certain place in the sky. Sure enough, a black dot suddenly appeared high up in the sky in that direction, and it descended rapidly. Not long after, it vaguely seemed to be a human figure. At this moment, Everyone was instantly in an uproar and exclamations rose and fell. At the entrance of the tavern, Old Ma and Lu Chen's expressions changed slightly, and they glanced at each other in unison. Old Ma whispered, "A cultivator?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He nodded and whispered, "It should be." He lost control of his flight and fell. Old Ma clenched his teeth and his expression became a bit more serious. Everyone in the cultivation world knew that to be able to fly, one had to be at least at the initial stage of the Foundation Realm. In a cultivation sect like the Thousand Years sect, a Foundation Realm cultivator was the strongest. The speed of the black shadow falling from the sky became faster and faster, and it even brought with it a sharp whistling sound. The direction of the falling shadow was also falling towards the village. For a moment, everyone was in an uproar and they all retreated, getting as far away from the falling shadow as possible. Not long after, a black shadow descended from the sky. As countless people screamed in shock, a loud bang rang out as it smashed into a house, creating a large hole in the roof. Dust immediately filled the air, and it felt like even the ground under its feet was trembling. The scene was so horrifying that even though everyone was just watching, they couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines in this scorching hot weather. After a moment, everyone slowly surrounded the house. Lu Chen and Old Ma were also mixed in the crowd. The owner of the unlucky house was standing outside the house, dumbfounded. He looked like he wanted to cry but no tears would come out. Soon, everyone saw the figure through the open door. It looked like an old man in his 50s. His body was lying limply on the ground. Blood flowed out of his orifices and he looked like he was dead. It was unknown how many bones were broken in his body, but he looked very miserable. The timid villagers had already retreated in fear, while the braver ones turned pale. Some of them even started to retch. At this time, someone suddenly exclaimed, pointing at the corpse, This person's clothes, it's the uniform of the Thousand Autumns sect's immortal elder." Everyone was shocked and turned their heads to look. Sure enough, they found the person to be somewhat familiar. Immediately, another uproar broke out and they all retreated. Old Ma and Lu Chen followed the crowd and walked to the back. Old Ma looked around to make sure no one was around and said in a low voice, "It's Elder Su Yunhe from the Thousand Autumn Gate." Lu Chen raised his eyebrows slightly and glanced at him, wanting to say something but hesitating. Old Ma saw his expression and frowned. "What's wrong?" After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "He was already dead when he fell. The fatal wound was on his chest. His Taoist robe on his right shoulder was torn. Though it's covered by blood, there's a metal plate stuck there. It should be the pattern of a giant tree." At this point he paused. Old Ma's expression changed slightly. Lu Chen turned to look at Old Ma and said, "It's the work of the demon sect of the Three Realms. It's probably revenge for what happened a few days ago." Old Ma gritted his teeth and suddenly spat. He cursed under his breath, "A bunch of lunatics." Qingshiteng village was near South Pine Mountain and was considered to be within the Thousand Autumn Gate sphere of influence. Thus, the clothes on the dead man were quickly recognized. After another half a day, a large group of cultivators from the Thousand Autumn Gate arrived at Qingshiteng village. The peace of the past was of course nowhere to be found. However, the village was not noisy at all. The reason was simple. In front of the stern-looking Thousand Autumn Gate cultivators, the atmosphere in Qingshiteng village was solemn. There were Thousand Autumn Gate disciples guarding the front and back of the village. Most of the villagers were as quiet as cicadas in winter, not even daring to breathe too loudly. The area near the dead man had the most Thousand Autumn Gate cultivators and seemed to have the highest status there. From time to time, someone would come out from that area and summon a few villagers for questioning. At this moment, Old Ma finally put on some clothes and was no longer naked. He stood with Lu Chen in the distance and looked at the house. After watching for a while, Lu Chen quietly nudged Old Ma and whispered, "I'm afraid the Thousand Autumn Gate is going to be furious." Old Ma shrugged and said, "Of course. Su Yunhe is at the peak of the foundational realm and is one of the two people with the highest cultivation in the gate. Aside from the gate leader, he is the next highest. The devil cult is really ruthless this time. It's equivalent to losing at least 30% of the Thousand Autumn Gate strength." Lu Chen shook his head without much expression on his face. Old Ma looked at him and lowered his voice. "It's rare for the devil cult to make such a big move." Lu Chen frowned and didn't say anything. After a while he whispered, "The pattern under the tree a few days ago, maybe it's for this?" Old Ma thought about it and nodded. "It should be, but this is good. At least it's not for you." Lu Chen raised his head and looked ahead. A few villagers had been brought out by the Thousand Autumns clan disciples, but no more villagers were called over for questioning. It was probably because the villagers here all spoke the same words, and there was no need to ask any more questions. But at this moment, his eyes suddenly narrowed and he let out a sound of surprise. His eyes stared at a certain spot in the crowd. Old Ma followed his gaze, and after a while he was also startled. Outside one of the houses, there was a group of 7,000 or 8,000 Autumn's clan disciples. Among them there was a handsome man. It was Li Ji. It had been a long time since they last saw each other, but this talented and extremely lucky young man did not seem to have changed at all. He was still as carefree and elegant as ever, and when he stood among a group of cultivators, he seemed to stand out from the crowd. Many villagers in the surroundings saw Li Ji and gasped in surprise. Obviously, everyone was very envious of him. This was especially so for some of the young women. Their eyes were practically shining as they stared at Li Ji. It was as if Li Ji turned around to look at them, they would be enchanted. Old Ma shook his head and smiled at Lu Qin. What a good appearance. I'm so envious. Lu Qin didn't reply. He stared at Li Ji for a while and then looked away. But at this time, from the corner of his eyes, he suddenly saw that in a secluded corner of the crowd, Miss Ding Dang was standing under a withered peach tree. She was looking at Li Ji from afar. Her eyes were bright and her face seemed to be shining with light. She was exceptionally beautiful. Chapter 35. By evening, Elder Su Yunha's remains had been moved away by the Thousand Autumns sect. However, the Thousand Autumns sect disciples who were guarding the village did not retreat. Instead, they searched the village carefully, but in the end they did not find anyone suspicious. After all, everyone here was someone who had been here for many years. In the end they had no choice but to retreat. Of course, this was not a trivial matter. One could imagine the huge waves that would be stirred up in Thousand Autumns sect. Because the demonic cult of the Three Realms, which had kept an unusually low profile for the past 10 years, had suddenly changed their ways and carried out such a violent vengeance. After Thousand Autumns sect reported this to the True Immortal League, what kind of undercurrents would flow in the middle of the righteous path? However, to the villagers of Qingshitang village and to most of the ordinary villagers, this was something that was too far away. After the Thousand Autumns sect's men left, Qingshitang village quickly regained its peace. The only person who was still indignant was the unlucky owner of the house whose roof had been smashed. However, he did not dare to speak to the Thousand Autumns sect about this unexpected disaster, and in the end he could only let the matter rest. However, in the eyes of some people, there seemed to be some inconspicuous changes in this peaceful village. After all, it was not the same as before. Lu Chen's life seemed to be the same as most people's. There was no change. He still strolled around every day with a harmless smile on his face. He was like a young man who had hope in cultivation but was unwilling to endure hardship. He was ready to live out his life leisurely like this. He was kind and amiable to most of the people in Clearwater Pond. Everyone knew him and liked him. However, if one were to really think about it, it seemed like no one could really become close friends with him. Year after year he maintained a distance between himself and most people, quietly living his life. Every time the sky turned dark, he would return to the lonely straw hut at the foot of the mountain alone. For some reason, Lu Qin did not dislike the darkness like most people did. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. Every time night came, lying in the straw hut was the time when he felt the most freedom. In the darkness, his thoughts would spread endlessly, and he would think of many things in the past. Perhaps he could do some secrets that others could not know about. That night, the reborn divine disk of 5 elements reappeared in his Dantian Sea of Qi. Even though this disk had relied on the last bit of water of life in that mysterious tree hole to be reborn, it looked exceptionally inferior. Even a sect like the Thousand Autumns sect would probably refuse to enter if they saw this kind of cultivation foundation under the immortal mirror. Even so, Lu Qin was still very happy if this 5 elements divine disk didn't have another side. As the disk silently turned, the black side was revealed again. After a period of adaptation and exploration, Lu Qin gradually understood what had happened in his Dantian. The black flame curse that had troubled him for 10 years seemed to have disappeared. It seemed like it had perished together with the life water. However, for some reason, the reborn 5 elements divine disk in his body, the foundation of a cultivator, had undergone a strange change. On the normal side of the disk, the 4 elemental pillars of metal, wood, water, and fire did not appear. Only the earth elemental pillar in the center had the lowest and shallowest pillar. This meant that although Lu Qin still had the body of a mortal, he once again had the foundation to cultivate. It was just that his innate talent was terrible, so he could only cultivate earth-type cultivation methods. Moreover, the speed of his cultivation of Dao techniques and divine abilities would be extremely slow. However, all of this was not too difficult for Lu Qin. Being able to regenerate the disc was the greatest gift to him. What surprised him was the other side of the disc, the black side. In this world, at least as far as he could remember, he had never heard of such a thing since ancient times. Firstly, the 5 elements divine disc had never had a positive or negative concept. Secondly, there had never been a black and empty 5 elements divine disc. In the darkness, he quietly looked at the black side of the 5 elements divine disc. He looked at the familiar little black flame in the center of the disc. Then he held his breath and slowly tried to activate that ball of flame. His divine sense was like a rope, slowly approaching that small cluster of black flames. In the darkness that no one knew about, in the silence at a certain moment, his eyes suddenly opened. There was no pain or emotion, but in his calm and solemn gaze, there seemed to be 2 balls of dark flames flashing in his eye sockets. It was the height of summer in July and the weather was getting hotter and hotter. However, because there was a clear stream that seemed to never dry up flowing through the village, the people of Qingshitang village were still living a more comfortable life than other places. One day when it was close to the end of the month, someone suddenly knocked on Lu Chen's straw hut. He opened the door and saw Ding Dang standing outside. Under the sunlight, she was still as beautiful as ever. Even though her face was a little red from the heat and there were a few drops of sweat on her forehead, she smiled when she saw Lu Chen and waved her hand to greet him. Lu Chen smiled and let her in. He said, "Why did you think of looking for me? What's the matter?" Ding Dang seemed to be in a good mood and very happy, as if something good had happened. She said to Lu Chen, "Can you do me a favor?" Lu Chen looked at her, and Ding Dong's face suddenly turned red, as if she had thought of something. Embarrassed, she smiled awkwardly and said, I still haven't collected enough spirit stones. Can I pay you back after a while?" Lu Chen indifferently waved his hands and said, "That's not a problem. I'm not in a rush to use the money. Speak, why are you looking for me today?" Ding Dang said, "Bring me to the Dragon Lake behind the mountain." "Dragon Lake?" "Yes." Ding Dang nodded her head vigorously and then happily smiled. "Why are you going to the Dragon Lake?" Lu Chen was a little flabbergasted and said, "The mountain is high and the road is long. The mountain path is not easy to walk and usually I don't see a shadow of a person. Why are you going there?" Ding Dang smiled, the joy in her eyes seemed to be unable to be suppressed. She looked like a proud hen that had just laid an egg and couldn't help but want to show off. But in the end she seemed to be able to endure it. However, the smile in her eyes was like rippling water. She gently said to Lu Chen, "I heard that the scenery there is very good, so I wanted to go and take a look." She spread her hands and said helplessly, "I've been in Qingshitang village for a few years and have never been to this tea mountain. I heard that the mountain path is like a maze. I thought about it and only you can help me." Chapter 36. Lu Chen stared at the girl in front of him. Under the morning light, her snow-white skin and slightly red cheeks made her seem like a peach blossom that had bloomed in this world. She was charming and enchanting, emitting a dazzling radiance. After a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, I will bring you there." Ding Dang cheered, smiling as she pulled on Lu Chen's sleeves, her eyes emitting a bright and amiable light, smiling, "Many thanks, I knew you are a good person." Lu Chen smiled, declining to comment, and said, "The Dragon Lake is in the west of Tea Mountain. We will need at least 4 hours to walk there. Do you want to prepare a bit, or do you want to leave now?" Ding Dang clenched her fist, looking very excited. Her mood was anxious and said, "Let's go now." Tea Mountain was not a towering mountain. Looking at it from the foot of the mountain was ordinary, but as the saying goes, looking at the mountain will cause the horse to run to death. Once truly walking up the mountain, the feeling was completely different. Especially the walking Lu Chen and Ding Dang, both were not cultivators, and were no different from ordinary mortals, so walking up the mountain was even more strenuous. Between the two, Lu Chen's physique was clearly much stronger than Ding Dong's. Along the way he walked, most of the time it was very easy, adding on to the fact that he was very familiar with the paths of Tea Mountain, bringing Ding Dang through the countless crisscrossing paths like a maze, his demeanor calm and at ease. On the other hand, although Ding Dang was full of energy at the start, not even half an hour later, her face gradually became pale, beads of sweat flowed down her face, and her breathing gradually became rough. She looked as if she had never done any heavy work before, nor did she have the appearance of someone who had walked long distances. Walking like this for a while, Lu Chen saw that Ding Dang could not hold on any longer, and could only stop to let her rest for a while. Ding Dang did not say anything, directly found a rock by the side of the mountain path, and sat down, gasping for breath, looking as if her whole body was about to go limp. Lucien shook his head and said to her, "You can't walk like this, why don't you go back first?" Although Ding Dong's face was pale white, but for some reason she was extremely determined. She firmly shook her head and said, "No need, I will be fine after resting for a while." Lucien shrugged and stopped talking. The two of them rested for the time it took to drink a cup of tea before Ding Dong stood up and said to Lucien, "Let's go." The two of them continued to walk forward. The mountain breeze blew, and the tea trees that covered the mountains and plains rustled, like a green ocean. Ding Dong's stamina was only at this level, and for the rest of the journey she would be so tired that she would not be able to move. Lucien could only stop to let her recover her stamina, and like this, time was wasted. According to Lucien's original plan, it would take about 4 hours to reach the Dragon Lake, but like this, the two of them spent more than half a day before they saw the calm lake at the top of the mountain. Although it took a lot of time, Lucien seemed to be extremely patient, and from start to finish he did not show any impatience towards Ding Dong. On the contrary, Ding Dong was a little embarrassed and said "sorry" to Lucien a few times, but was always laughed off by Lucien. But Lucien was also a little surprised that Ding Dong was able to persevere and walk all the way to the Dragon Lake, and had a whole new level of respect for this girl. When they walked to the side of the Dragon Lake, he pointed to the calm surface of the water, and said to Ding Dong, "This is the Dragon Lake." Ding Dong walked 2 steps forward, only to feel a cool breeze blowing over, bringing with it a moist and gentle aura, causing her to take a deep breath, and her face revealed a satisfied and happy expression. She still wanted to walk forward, but was suddenly pulled back by Lucien. Ding Dong was shocked and turned her head. "What's wrong?" Lucien looked at the distant Dragon Lake and said, "Don't get too close to the lake." Ding Dong asked, "Why?" Lucien said, "I heard people say that there seems to be a strange fish in the Dragon Lake, its body is rather big, and it's a little strange, maybe it will hurt people." Ding Dong's eyes widened and said, "What, you've seen it before?" Lucien shook his head and said, "I heard people say it, I've come here a few times but I've never seen it before." Ding Dong could not help but laugh and said, "Then you still believe it?" Lucien laughed and shrugged his shoulders and said, "Who knows, anyways you can see the scenery from afar, as long as you don't get too close to the lake it'll be fine." Ding Dong nodded her head and then looked at Lucien and said, "Lucien, thank you for bringing me up, I'll be fine by myself, you can go back first." Lucien was startled and said in shock, "What? Then what will you do when you go back?" Ding Dong waved her hands and said with a smile, "I'm not a child, I'll walk the way back myself. Right now I just want to stay here alone for a while, you can go back first." Lucien was silent for a moment and then raised his head to look at the sky and said, "It's already getting late, when you go down the mountain alone, it will most likely be dark, and at that time the mountain path will be even harder to walk, can you really do it?" Ding Dong hesitated for a moment, but her expression was still resolute, and heavily nodded her head and said, "I'll be fine, you don't have to worry, I just want to stay here alone for a while." Lucien looked at her for a moment, and then did not say anything and only nodded his head and said, "All right then, you be careful." With that he turned around and walked back the way he came. Ding Dong looked at his back figure walking away, and a complicated expression flitted across her face. It seemed to be a bit gentle, but also seemed to be a bit apologetic, but very quickly she still turned around, and once again looked at the calm lake. Just at this time, footsteps suddenly sounded out from behind her. Ding Dong turned around to look, and was immediately startled. It was Lucien who had returned. She saw Lucien walk over with large strides, and in his hand was an object and stuffed it into Ding Dong's hands. Ding Dong lowered her head to look and saw that it was a torch, and then she heard Lucien lightly say, "When you go down the mountain, if it's dark and you don't know the way, then break a few pieces of firewood to use as a torch, and then wave it towards the foot of the mountain. If you're lucky I'll see you and come up the mountain to pick you up, but if I forget about this matter or fall asleep, then you can only blame your own bad luck." Ding Dong's slender white fingers gently clenched, holding onto the torch in her palm. She then raised her head to look at Lucien, her eyes as clear as water. After a moment she suddenly smiled sweetly, nodded and said, "All right." Lucien laughed and turned around, not looking back, and not long after he disappeared at the end of the mountain path. Ding Dong looked at the man's disappearing figure, a light flashed in her eyes, and no one knew what she was thinking about. Chapter 37. However, just as Lucien left, Ding Dong seemed to have sensed something. She turned towards the direction of the Dragon Lake and saw a figure appear from behind a large rock by the lakeside. Ding Dong's lips curled into a joyful smile. She tucked the fire lighter into her bosom and strode towards that direction. Tea Mountain and Qingshitang Village were just inconspicuous villages under the influence of the Chenqiu sect in South Pine Mountain. The Chenqiu sect itself was actually just an inconspicuous small sect in the incomparably powerful cultivation world of Middle-earth. On the vast and boundless Middle-earth, there were billions of living beings, countless powerful cultivation sects and cultivators, just like the stars in the night sky. In the current human cultivation world, Zheng Xianming was fully deserving of the title of number one power in the world. This was because it was not just a single sect. In fact, Zheng Xianming was an alliance of hundreds and thousands of powerful cultivation sections. As long as one was famous in Middle-earth, their strength could be seen on the stage. Other than heretical existences like the Three Realms Divine Sect, the rest were almost all members of Zheng Xianming. This huge organization had a very long history. In the long years, this special and huge organization had formed a foundation that was different from all the other cultivation sects, and that was the Immortal City. Most of the cultivation sects in the world, no matter big or small, were like the Thousand Autumns sect. They occupied a blessed land for their disciples to cultivate, and then naturally developed a city at the foot of the mountain next to the spiritual land. However, the True Immortal Alliance did not do so. This organization directly built a huge city on the most fertile and vast land of the Middle-earth, the Four Rivers Plain. After many years of expansion and repair, the Immortal City was already the most prosperous and powerful city in Middle-earth. It was also the most desirable city. All of the important sects of Zheng Xianming were also located in this city. In the huge and ancient city, there were countless people living, bustling with activity, coming and going. Between the intersection of light and darkness, there were countless sorrows and joys of separation and reunion. There was light and there was darkness. It was like the sun rising and setting, an endless cycle of reincarnation. Inside the huge city, there was an extremely secretive place. It looked like a secret room, but it was also very spacious. There was a large round table in the room. The center of the table was empty, and a ball of flame was burning on it. The flame swayed silently, but if one looked closely, they would find that under the light of the flame, there was a pile of strange bones. They looked like beasts but not beasts. They looked ferocious and terrifying, and even looked a little like the faces of evil spirits in ancient legends. Apart from that, there was only a lone figure sitting on a high-backed iron chair at the big round table with 11 seats in the room. It was a person shrouded in a black and red robe. There was also a hooded cloak on his back, covering his hair and neck. In front of his face he even wore a golden mask. In other words, other than a pair of eyes, this person did not reveal a single inch of skin. The golden mask was carved with the face of a terrifying evil spirit. It looked a little like the burning bones at the center of the table, and it also added a gloomy aura to the figure. The entire secret room was silent. This mysterious masked man just sat there quietly, staring at the burning ball of flame. He did not move for a long time. The fire burned fiercely, and it was reflected in his pupils, as if there were two balls of flame burning in the depths of his eyes. After an unknown amount of time, suddenly, a soft sound came from a corner of the secret room. Then a door appeared from the shadows and a person pushed the door open and walked in. It was a man who looked to be in his 30s. His face was ordinary and he looked like the kind of person that could be seen on the streets every day. Even his clothes were very ordinary, and he would not attract anyone's attention. The man's eyes swept around the secret room, and soon fell on the mysterious figure beside the strange round table. His face tightened, and there was a hint of nervousness in the depths of his eyes. But his expression did not change much. He quickly walked over and with a table between them, he bowed respectfully. "Qin," he greets the elder. The head of the man wearing the golden evil spirit mask moved slightly, and then he looked at him. After a moment, a strange voice sounded. It was hoarse and low, and it sounded like metal and stone crisscrossing. For a moment, it was impossible to tell whether it was a man or a woman. He only felt a dull pain in his eardrums. How was the interrogation? Qin, he took a deep breath and his head was slightly lowered. That guy couldn't withstand the punishment and he's already dead. But from what he said before he died, he should not know Hei Lang of the past. The flame in the secret room suddenly sprang up, like a silent and terrible evil spirit, and suddenly roared. It was hair-raising. A suffocating silence suddenly descended upon this dark secret chamber. The man named Qin, he stood there like a javelin, his eyes looking down at his nose looking down at his heart, not even daring to breathe loudly. After a while, the burning flame gradually calmed down, and the golden evil spirit mask raised its head again. The strange and hoarse voice sounded again. Almost all the fish that escaped the net in the Battle of the Barren Valley have been investigated, and there is still nothing. What do you plan to do next? Jianghu was silent for a moment and then said, after the disaster 10 years ago, the traitor disappeared without a trace. Although we have been trying hard to track him down, every time we find a clue, it is either cut off by others, or it alarms some forces in Zhangxianming, and they often backfire on us. From this, we can see that there is an extremely powerful force in Zhangxianming that is protecting the traitor. Behind the golden evil spirit mask, there seemed to be a cold snort full of hatred and viciousness. Go on. Jianghu said in a low voice, I think that the traitor is not in the celestial city now. Perhaps he is hidden by some big shot in some corner of the world, or even in some random small sect, pretending to be a harmless nobody to humans and animals so that he can avoid being hunted by us. There was no reply from behind the mask. Jianghu paused for a moment, then said, so in my opinion maybe we should change to another method. What is it? The golden mask moved slightly as if it was a little moved. In the past 10 years, all kinds of signs show that Zhangxianming is inextricably linked to the Battle of the Barren Valley. So if we want to find the traitor He Lang, we should also put more effort into Zhangxianming. Previously, it was too difficult to find a way among the many cultivation sections. Chapter 38. The golden-masked man was silent for a while, then nodded slowly and said, what you said makes some sense. However, over the years there have been spies lurking in Zhangxianming to investigate this matter, but they have not found anything. Do you have any new ideas? Jianghu shook his head and said, this kind of thing is the same. We can only investigate carefully and trace every little bit of the past. The Floating Clouds Division of the True Immortal Alliance has always protected those shadows whose identities and origins are extremely secretive. We don't know how many secrets are hidden within it, and it has also been the focus of our investigation for many years. It's just that the results have not been obvious all these years. At this point, Jianghu paused for a while, then his eyes flashed and he said, but I have an idea that might be helpful. Say it. In the past we have always tried our best to track down those shadows, whose identities and origins are very mysterious, but it often takes twice the effort for half the result. However, these days I have been secretly thinking, maybe we can change our idea and start from those who come into contact with the shadows? The golden-masked man suddenly raised his head. Obviously this sentence had aroused his interest. Jianghu immediately noticed this and a hint of joy flashed in his eyes, but his expression did not change. He continued to say, Zhangxianming has always attached great importance to the safety of the shadows, and the protection is extremely tight. However, people who come into contact with the shadows such as inspectors, surveillance and other people, although they also have their own ways of keeping secrets, are often in the open such as the personal disciples of the major sections. So, if we start from these people and follow the clues, very good. Let's do this. A shout directly interrupted Jianghu's words. Jianghu was not angry but happy. He quickly bowed and said, yes, I will obey. The golden-masked man slowly stood up, his eyes staring at the terrifying skeletons in the fire in front of him. Suddenly he let out a low roar like the roar of an evil spirit, which made people tremble with fear. A sound of hatred came from behind the mask and he said coldly, the great foundation of the divine sect and the lives of the 3 elders should have been the most prosperous situation in the past 500 years, but it was all destroyed in the hands of that traitor. If this fiend doesn't die, how can our god sect live? As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly waved one of his arms, and with a boom, a ball of flames rose up, the fire blazed as if it wanted to swallow the world, and in the roaring flames, that voice also seemed to be burning, like metal striking stone, like a hoarse roar, shouting and cursing towards the darkness. Crush the bones and scatter the ashes. Soul extraction and soul refining. Let him die. Night fell as usual. The strange and mournful wails of ghosts and the wind once again spread throughout the tea mountain. In the darkness of the night, Lu Qin stood outside the hut and glanced at the tea mountain. All he saw was silence and deep. The darkness was as thick as an ink-smeared painting. He stood there expressionlessly for a moment, then walked back to the hut, lay down on the bed, closed his eyes and fell asleep without a sound. The next time he saw Ding Dang it was already 2 days later. At that time it was morning. Ding Dang was walking by a clear stream in the village. Her beautiful appearance was like the most beautiful peach blossom, dazzling, and in this season where the peach blossoms had already withered, she was still in full bloom, attracting the gazes of countless people in the village. But she did not care about the surrounding gazes, her eyes were so bright as if she was standing on the clouds, disdaining the dust, and also as if she was a person with a different fate. Even the people who greeted her rarely paid attention. She kept smiling but did not show her smile to anyone. She was happy from the bottom of her heart, but only wanted to let herself be happy, and was not willing to give even a little bit to the people beside her. Until she saw Lu Qin standing at the entrance of the small wine shop. Ding Dang stopped for the first time, a trace of hesitation flashed across her face, and then she warmly smiled at Lu Qin from afar. Like a peach blossom in the spring wind, tender and beautiful, but also seemed to have a bit of reserved nobility, causing people to not dare to approach. Lu Qin returned a smile, nodded to her, and then turned to walk into the small wine shop. Old Ma sat at the table. The wine shop was still not doing well, so his face did not look good. Lu Qin walked to his side, sat down and asked with a smile, "What is it?" Old Ma glanced at him and said unhappily, "You already know the answer but still ask." Lu Qin laughed, "You are not really relying on this wine shop to make a living, why are you looking at it so seriously?" Old Ma snorted, went to the counter to get a jug of wine, and threw it to him, then said in a low voice, "The matter with Su Yunhe from the Thousand Autumns sect has already been spread back to Zhengxianming. I heard that the higher-ups are furious and are investigating this matter." Lu Qin poured a cup of wine, thought for a moment and said, "This matter is indeed a bit over the line, but it is also a bit strange. At least for more than 10 years, the Three Realms Divine Sect has not done something so out of line." Old Ma shrugged and said, "Maybe these years they have been suppressed too much, or maybe there is a new figure in the evil sect, and in order to establish their power, they killed the chicken to scare the monkey or something." As he spoke he looked at Lu Qin and said, "Hey, tell me, why is it that the evil sect, this broken thing, how many times have they been beaten and destroyed, yet they are able to survive every time, dying like an unkillable bug?" Lu Qin was silent. After a while his voice suddenly became a bit lower and he said, "Maybe it is because the people in there are especially simple-minded, believing in some things to the point that even we can't understand." Old Ma's expression changed slightly, looked at Lu Qin's expression and then coughed, but changed the topic and said, "Oh yes, there is news from old Lu. He has already handed over all the matters at Immortal City, and will officially retire in a few days to go back to his original sect." Lu Qin nodded and said, "That is not bad. Old Lu is a good person." The two of them chatted casually in the tavern just like they had done countless times in the past. In this ordinary mountain village, the two of them looked like ordinary people, staying in the most ordinary corner of the world, quietly living an ordinary and leisurely life. At noon, when Lu Qin was about to walk out of the door, he suddenly heard Old Ma suddenly said, "You seem to look good these days." Lu Qin's body paused for a moment, smiled and did not say anything and walked out. He walked all the way back to the hut at the foot of Tea Mountain, closed the door and sat cross-legged on the bed. Not long after, in his Qi, the brand new but the most ordinary five elements divine disc slowly emerged. Lu Qin's face was calm and he just quietly adjusted his breath. Gradually, a very subtle spiritual power appeared in his Qi meridian and slowly flowed. Chapter 39. This wisp of aura was peaceful and upright. Although it was subtle, it carried a faint and heavy aura. It was pure earth spiritual power. The world was based on the five elements, and this was especially true for the cultivators of the central region. The attributes and aptitudes on the five elements divine disc almost limited their future cultivation direction and the approximate upper limit. This subtle earth spiritual power slowly traveled through his meridians and then finally converged into his Dantian's Qi. For cultivators, no matter what realm they were in, such boring daily cultivation was the most basic foundation of cultivation. However, when Lu Qin inspected the results in his Dantian, he still felt a little helpless. Perhaps after all, the black flame curse had caused too much damage to his body in the past 10 years. Now the foundation of this reborn five elements divine disc was really too poor. Although he could barely cultivate, whether it was the spiritual power he attracted or the speed of cultivation, his performance was quite poor. He was even worse than ordinary disciples. The only thing that looked good was probably the earth-type spiritual power that Lu Qin absorbed into his body. In terms of quality, it was relatively pure and thick. However, this was actually not strange. After all, there was only one earth-type divine pillar on his five elements divine disc, which meant that he could only absorb earth-type spiritual power. Of course, it was easy for it to be pure. In fact, as far as he knew, under normal circumstances, a person with such a foundation could not enter a cultivation sect to cultivate because his foundation was too poor. Generally speaking, ordinary cultivators would at least have 2 divine pillars. At the same time, the quality of the divine pillars could not be too bad. If one had 3 or 4 divine pillars, he would be a genius with an extremely high foundation. In the future, the upper limit of cultivation would also be very high. As for those who had all 5 divine pillars, they were rare geniuses in the world. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Lu Qin chuckled softly with a hint of self-mockery. However, he did not feel too sad. Perhaps to him, the current situation was already much better than before. Except, the dark side. He silently put away the smile at the corner of his mouth and sat quietly in the lonely and silent thatched hut. The 5 elements divine disk in the sea of qi in his dantian slowly rotated and flipped. A touch of black quietly appeared, and then he saw the dark side. As soon as the wisp of black flame appeared, the blackness suddenly spread out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, Lu Chen's entire dantian and sea of energy transformed into a deep black sea. At this time, a strange, desolate killing intent faintly seeped out of his body. Lu Chen was awake. He was clear about the changes that had occurred in his body, although he still did not understand why such a strange change would occur in his body. He held his breath. After a while, he began to gently try to absorb the spiritual power of the outside world in this dark dantian, trying to see if he could cultivate. The spiritual power of the world was based on the 5 elements. This was an unshakable traditional belief in the central region for millions of years. Of the spiritual power of the 5 elements was the foundation that cultivators could absorb and cultivate. Therefore Lu Qin did not feel anything. His attempts seemed to be useless. Under the darkness of the 5 elements divine disk, no aura could enter his body. Perhaps the ancient legends were right. Without the 5 elements divine pillar, he would not be able to absorb any 5 elements spiritual energy. Thus, it would be impossible for him to cultivate. Lu Qin tried for a long time, but after an entire hour, he still did not attract the slightest spiritual power. The black and cold 5 elements divine disk looked like a vicious curse, coldly mocking him. He sighed and dispersed his power. The 5 elements divine disk slowly turned over, the darkness receded, and the Dantian Sea of Qi returned to its original appearance. So he became an ordinary person again. In the thatched hut, he sat quietly as if he was lost in thought. Lu Qin walked out of his thatched hut and stretched his body. The mountain breeze brought a refreshing fragrance of tea down from the mountains. There was a faint, sweet fragrance in the air. His complexion seemed to be like what old Ma said that day. In the past few days his complexion had begun to slowly improve. This change was not obvious, but there were some clues. Lu Qin stretched his body, and just as he was thinking about whether or not he should go to old Ma's place at the foot of the mountain to drink, he saw Ding Dong's figure. The girl walked over from the foot of the mountain, and saw Lu Qin in front of his thatched hut. She stopped and smiled at him. Lu Qin smiled and nodded and said, "Where are you going?" Ding Dong pointed to the mountain and said, "I'm going to the Dragon Lake." Lu Qin was startled and said, "You're going alone?" Ding Dong nodded and said, "Didn't you bring me there once? I already know the way." Lu Qin looked at her and said, "The mountain road is hard to walk, can you do it? Do you want me to accompany you?" Ding Dong smiled and said, "No need, I'm fine alone." Lu Qin said, "Why are you going there again? Walking up and down for an entire day and you'll be half dead tired." Ding Dong said, "I'm going to see the scenery of the Dragon Lake is very beautiful." In a short few days she would climb the mountain to see the scenery of the lake. Lu Qin was silent for a moment, but in the end he did not say these words. In the end he only smiled and said, "Then you be careful, if it's late at night, it's better to light a torch and wave it a few times. When I see it, I'll come and find you." Ding Dong smiled sweetly, her smile was bright and beautiful, and said, "Many thanks, but I don't think there's a need." Saying that, she continued to walk up the mountain. After walking for a while, suddenly Lu Chen's voice came from behind and said, "That's right, Ding Dong, I have something to ask you." Ding Dong turned her head and said, "What? The last time you went to the Dragon Lake, did you see any strange big fish?" Ding Dong shook her head and said with a smile, "No, the Dragon Lake has always been like that, there are no strange fish. Where did you hear such unreliable words from?" Lu Qin shrugged his shoulders and said with a smile, "So it's like that, then I was tricked by someone. It's fine, you can go." Ding Dong smiled at him and turned to continue walking. Lu Qin watched her figure gradually disappear into the distance, disappearing behind the mountain road and spirit tea trees. He then raised his head to look at the peak of the tea mountain, and his eyes seemed to have some thoughts. But then he lightly shook his head and turned to walk down the mountain road and walk towards the village below. Qingshui Creek was as clear as ever, and as calm as before, adding on the beautiful bamboo on both sides, it was like a painting. Chapter 40. As Lu Qin walked over, he paused when he passed by the big locust tree. He first glanced at the roots, then walked to the big rock with a smile, and said to the old fisherman who was sitting there fishing, "Old Yu, how was today's harvest?" Old Yu's bamboo hat tilted and he did not say a word. Lu Qin, who already knew the result, seemed to smile even more happily. He simply squatted down beside Old Yu and said, "I say, Old Yu, I don't think it's a good idea for you to just sit and wait like this." The old fisherman did not say a word and even looked at him blankly. Lu Qin ignored him and said with a smile, "Why don't we go somewhere else to fish?" Old Yu frowned and said, "Where to fish?" Lu Qin pointed to the mountain in the distance and said with a smile, "Let's go to the Dragon Lake on the mountain. The water is deep there and there's a lot of rain there. Maybe we'll have a chance to find the big fish you want." Old Yu shook his head blankly and said, "The mountain is too high, and why would the fish be on the mountain?" Lu Qin laughed and was about to say a few more words when suddenly there was a flash in the corner of his eye. He saw the fishing rod floating in the water shake violently. This time both Lu Qin and Old Yu were shocked. After so long, no matter who it was, they had long gotten used to the feeling of never being able to catch a fish in the stream. Could it be that there was a change today? A moment later, Old Yu and Lu Qin sprang up and hurriedly put away the fishing rod. But after a moment, when the fishing line was put away, the two looked at the same time and saw that there was an ordinary fish only the size of a palm hanging on the hook. It was a little bigger than the small gray fish in the stream, big enough to bite the bait, but obviously not at the level of a big fish. The two of them looked at each other and after a while, Old Yu sat down again in a daze. Lu Qin shrugged and grabbed the fish to unhook it. At the same time he said, "Well, even this kind of fish is rare. Maybe there will be a chance in the future." He'd only spoken halfway when Lu Qin's voice suddenly stopped abruptly. Because right when his palm grabbed onto the body of the fish that had been pierced by the fish hook and was struggling with all its might yet was helpless, a strange aura suddenly appeared out of thin air, and it inexplicably carried traces of icy cold killing intent as it seeped into his meridians. Almost at the same time, Lu Qin felt a sudden tremor in his dantian. The divine disk of 5 elements suddenly appeared and flipped over. Dark aura swarmed in all directions, like the howling of evil ghosts, like the roar of darkness. The intense darkness enveloped everything. What? A muffled sound came from the side. Old Yu turned his head and saw that the small fish fell from Lu Qin's hand and fell heavily to the ground. The fish hook that had fallen out of the fish's mouth had somehow sunk into the fish's body, directly piercing the belly of the small fish. The small fish twisted on the ground a few times, quickly lost its strength and then died. Old Yu frowned, glanced at Lu Qin and said, "This fish can't be eaten, why kill it? It's better to let it go." After saying that, he turned his head again, put the bait again, and then threw out the fishing rod to continue fishing. Lu Qin quietly stood behind the old fisherman and did not speak for a long time. After a long time, even when Old Yu was a little puzzled, he heard Lu Qin's voice suddenly become low and slow, saying, "You're right, I hit it too hard." Old Yu was a little puzzled, turned his head to look at Lu Qin, but saw that his face was as usual, and his expression was calm as if there was nothing wrong. Old Yu was too lazy to pay attention to him, and returned his gaze back to the water. Lu Qin stood for a while, then turned and left. He did not continue to walk into the village, even if this place was not far from Old Ma's little tavern. He turned in another direction and once again walked in the direction of the tea mountain, walking all the way back to the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. Before entering, he glanced at the top of the tea mountain, and saw that there was not a single person on the peaceful mountain peak. At this moment, Ding Dang had already walked to who knows where, perhaps she was trekking on a mountain path somewhere. When Lu Qin returned to the grass hut, he sat on the bed without saying a word, and then lowered his head in silent thought. He recalled everything that had just happened little by little, and even every movement and feeling he did not let go of any of it. His expression gradually became somewhat grave, and his gaze became sharper and brighter, as if he had faintly guessed something. After a while he suddenly got up and walked towards the door. At the same time, on his right hand that was hanging by his side, his 5 fingers slightly curled, and a moment later, a black dagger silently slid out from his sleeve and fell into his hand. The sun was shining brightly outside and the sky was clear. He slightly narrowed his eyes and looked around, and after a moment of silence he walked towards the tea mountain. The mountain was very quiet, and other than the rustling sound of the mountain wind blowing through the tea trees, there were very few other sounds. Occasionally, there would be some bird cries from the depths of the forest in the distance. The tea mountain was not a majestic and vast mountain, but there were indeed quite a few wild animals on the mountain. It was just that for many years the land in front of the mountain had been cleared by the human race to plant tea trees, and most of the birds and beasts had also left, avoiding the human race and moving to higher peaks or the back of the mountain. The black dagger in Lu Chen's hand was dull, as if it could not refract light at all. It was restrained and deep, but the edge was extremely thin. His hand was steady and calm, but for some reason the dagger seemed to give off the illusion of trembling slightly. It was not fear, nor was it fear. Instead, it was the excitement of reuniting after a long time, as if they had not seen each other for many years. Even the dagger seemed to be yearning for something. The man's gaze swept around and he slowly walked forward. Unknowingly, Lu Chen's face had become indifferent. About halfway up the mountain the forest became quieter, but at this height he felt that the surrounding birds' cries were getting louder, and on some of the tall trees he could often see the figures of squirrels. Suddenly the grass in front of him shook, and then a gray head appeared. It was a gray rabbit that was commonly seen in the nearby mountains. Its mouth kept moving as if it was chewing something, and at the same time, it looked around cautiously. Then it saw Lu Chen standing on the mountain road not far away. It was a gentle man, his face calm, and even at that moment, there seemed to be a gentle smile hanging on the corner of his mouth. Obviously, the trace of coldness and sternness that had vaguely appeared on him not long ago had suddenly disappeared without a trace. Chapter 41. The gray rabbit shrank back a little, still looking at the person who suddenly appeared with full vigilance. However, the person didn't seem to have an obvious murderous aura, so the simple-minded rabbit didn't turn around and run. Its ears even pricked up, but soon, it felt that it should be further away from the dangerous human, so it retracted its head and prepared to turn around and run. The moment it lowered its head, the two long ears of the gray rabbit suddenly moved. At that moment the little animal seemed to have suddenly heard something. It was a somewhat sharp and mournful sound of the wind breaking through the air. The gray rabbit jerked its head up, but it was too late. A chill like cold water enveloped it, and the last thing it saw was a cold and merciless black dagger piercing through the air. It didn't even make a sound as it easily pierced into the rabbit's chest. The gray rabbit fell into the grass. After a while, a trace of blood flowed out from the wild grass. Lu Chen walked over and squatted down beside the grass. He reached out and grabbed the dead rabbit from the grass. After taking a look, he reached out and pulled out the dagger. The black dagger directly pierced the gray rabbit's chest, killing it in one blow. Dark red blood flowed out as Lu Chen watched this scene silently. Suddenly his body trembled. At that moment, his expression was extremely complicated and strange. There was both shock and astonishment, pleasant surprise and comprehension. In the end, there was even a trace of disbelief and fear. A subtle black spiritual power once again quietly seeped into his body and slowly swam in his meridians like a black phantom. In his Dantian sea of qi, the dark five elements divine disk also surged, turning his Dantian into a dark world. At the center of this strange world was a small clump of slowly burning black flame. The wisp of black spiritual power swam in the meridians of his whole body and finally quietly entered his Dantian. Then, like a drop of water flowing into the sea, it was suddenly absorbed by an invisible force and directly integrated into the black flame. The black flame shuddered, wavered, and then calmed down. Nothing seemed to have changed. However, Lu Chen knew that he could feel that there was a slight difference. Even if the change was so slight that it could be ignored, he could still feel that the black fire had become slightly stronger after absorbing the black spiritual power. What exactly was that black spiritual power? Lu Chen lowered his head to look at the dead rabbit, and his face suddenly became abnormally pale. It had happened twice, in the Qingshui stream at the foot of the mountain and in the wild grass of the tea mountain. That little fish and this gray rabbit did not seem to have any similarities, but in reality they had something in common. It was the moment of struggle before death. It was the moment when life was about to end and death was about to arrive. Lu Chen felt the terrifying black spirit force seep into his body. This kind of power, this kind of spiritual force, it was unheard of. It wasn't within the five elements, it vaguely lingered between life and death. It was like the aura of death, necromancy energy. Zhang Jiuping was 37 years old this year. He had a calm temperament and was serious in his work. He was born in the famous Tianluo sect, and his cultivation was not bad. He was entrusted by the sect to work in Zhengxianmeng. After passing through several halls he came to Fiyunji, which was under the control of Shui Ying, the beloved subordinate of Lord Tianlan, and became an inspector. The patrol inspector was a good position, but it wasn't a good one at the same time. The good thing was that there wasn't too much fighting and killing. All they had to do was patrol the various places and contact some shadows, who were extremely mysterious and secretive. Occasionally they could earn some extra spirit stones. It was a safe and beneficial position. The reason why it wasn't a particularly good position was that the shadows under the Floating Clouds Bureau, other than those who had snuck into the bureau to scam for food and drinks, were mostly weird people and monsters with strange personalities. Furthermore, they had to patrol the place all year round. Zhang Jioping had been in this position for 3 years. In these 3 years he had done a good job and almost never made any mistakes. Therefore, some big shots in Zheng Xianming thought highly of him. They were planning to train him and promote him to do some more important things. He might even be in charge of an important position. However, in this life, luck was very mysterious and hard to predict. Just when he was about to make a name for himself after lying dormant for many years, something happened to Zhang Jioping. Without any signs or clues, this outstanding inspector in Fiyunji and Zheng Xianming died in the depths of an inconspicuous alley in Vermilion Bird Street in the north of the Immortal City. He died miserably. His body was stained with blood. When his body was found, it was quickly moved back to Fiyunji. Then, it could be roughly determined that the murderer should be from the divine sect of the Three Realms. This was because the murderer used a unique skill of the divine sect of the Three Realms. In addition, Zhang Jioping's body was covered with wounds, but they were not caused by a fierce battle. According to some special people in Zheng Xianming who came to see him, it might be a method of torture. It was hard to imagine who would dare to do such a cruel thing to the people of Zheng Xianming, which had gathered tens of thousands of cultivation sects in the world. But if it was the divine sect of the Three Realms, everything seemed to make sense. What made the big shots in Zheng Xianming even angrier was that this happened in the Immortal City, right under the nose of Zheng Xianming. From this, it could be seen how rampant the divine sect of the Three Realms, which had been hidden for many years, suddenly became. All kinds of orders and investigations were sent out from Zheng Xianming. The atmosphere in the huge Immortal City was a little tense. And in Fiyunji the atmosphere was even more tense and gloomy. Old Lu came out of the room where the body was placed. There were already many people standing outside the room, almost all of them were from Fiyunji. There were people from Fiyunji who were familiar with him who came over to ask. He took a deep breath, his face was very ugly but he did not say anything. He just shook his head silently. After a while he said in a low voice, "Very tragic." The surrounding people became silent. After a while someone started to curse a few times. Old Lu sighed, looked up at the sky and said in a low voice, "How did old Zhang offend those lunatics from the demonic sect?" Another person who was also a Fiyunji inspector snorted coldly and said, "Who knows, those lunatics can't be judged by common sense." Speaking till here he paused for a while, a trace of hesitation flashed across his face and said, "Old Zhang is usually not very flamboyant, he shouldn't have become enemies with the demonic sect. Unless the demonic sect found him for something else?" Old Lu raised his head and just at the same time the others also looked over here. They looked at each other, their faces changed slightly at the same time, and then said in unison, "Shadow." Chapter 42. Old Lu took a deep breath and said, "Who is the evil sect looking for?" "Don't know, most of the identities of those shadows are hidden, even we are not sure." Old Lu pondered for a moment, then smiled bitterly and said, "If it is really to find a shadow, the evil sect actually did not hesitate to kill people in Immortal City, that shadow's identity and position must be incomparably important. Who exactly is it?" Someone at the side suddenly snorted and said, "Fiyunji has 72 patrols, the number of shadows, whether in the light or in the dark, is even more than that, how can it be so easy to find?" Old Lu was silent for a moment, suddenly said, "Old Zhang is usually very efficient if I remember correctly, the shadows that he contacts, is the one that among all the patrols?" No one around spoke. Old Lu smiled bitterly, looked around, then faintly said, "Maybe it is a coincidence, but if it is not, I'm afraid, there is a mole here." Old Lu looked around, smiled, there was some bitterness in his smile, turned and walked away muttering in a low voice, "The world will not be peaceful from now on." Pah! A rabbit was thrown on the table, giving Old Ma a fright, then he looked up and saw Lu Qin. Old Ma said, "What is it?" Lu Qin sat opposite him, said indifferently, "I have been drinking your wine all day, today I went up the mountain to catch a wild rabbit, brought it over to go with your wine." Old Ma looked at Lu Qin suspiciously, said, "You are so good?" Lu Chen said, I caught it along the way. Old Ma grabbed the wild rabbit by its ear, lifted it up to take a look, said, there is no poison in this rabbit, right? No, I never do that kind of thing. Old Ma spat, looked at Lu Chen with disdain, said, what can't you do? The poison that you used in the past can at least kill the people in this village. Lu Chen said seriously, I did not say that I did not poison. What I mean is that there is no need to poison you. I never do that kind of stupid thing. Damn it. Old Ma kicked him and Lu Chen dodged it calmly. Then Old Ma stood up with a grunt and carried the rabbit into the kitchen. An hour later, a large pot of steaming hot and fragrant red braised rabbit was placed on the table, and the fragrance it emitted caused one's mouth to water. It was rare for Lu Chen to praise Old Ma. Looks like your skills are pretty good. Old Ma wiped the sweat off his forehead and said proudly, of course. Without calling for Lu Chen, he picked up a piece of rabbit meat with his chopsticks and threw it into his mouth, chewing it in big mouthfuls. Lu Chen smiled and picked up his chopsticks. Just as he was about to reach out, he suddenly heard Old Ma make an indistinct sound and then spit out the rabbit meat on the table. Lu Chen frowned and said, what's wrong? Could it be that a fatty like you can actually make something poisonous out of nothing? Old Ma smacked his lips a few times and said with a strange expression, this rabbit meat is a little strange. Why is it so sour? That shouldn't be the case, right? Lu Chen was startled and slowly put down the chopsticks in his hand. His gaze swept over the pot of rabbit meat and after a moment he asked softly, very sour? It's extremely sour, that's strange. Old Ma poured a cup of wine from the side and rinsed his mouth. Then he shook his head and said, what the hell? I've never eaten such sour rabbit meat in my life. Where did you catch it? Lu Chen looked at the rabbit meat quietly and said, I caught it from the tea mountain. Old Ma mumbled and paused for a moment before he couldn't help but try a piece. In the end he immediately spat it out and scolded, this isn't a fucking wild rabbit, it's a sour rabbit. Hey Lu Chen, why don't you try it? There was no expression on Lu Chen's face. After a while he said, you've already tried it. Do you think I don't believe you? This rabbit meat can't be eaten anymore. Throw it away. After speaking he stood up and walked out of the tavern. As he walked on the bluestone path, Lu Chen's expression looked a little ugly. His gaze was straight ahead and he silently walked back to his grass hut at the foot of the mountain. But just as he was about to enter the door, his body suddenly paused and he raised his head to look at the tea mountain. On that distant mountain peak, everything was as calm as usual. The wind blew through the tea trees and the mountain forest was silent. Apart from the direction of the back of the mountain, a wisp of black smoke suddenly floated up. There were no flames, no torches, and there was no one waving them. There was only a thin wisp of black smoke curling up. Lu Chen silently stood where he was, looking at the black smoke on the distant mountain. After a while he opened the door and walked in. With a bang he tightly closed the door behind him. It was as if he had shut the entire world behind him. The sound of the wind gradually grew, becoming somewhat mournful. The sky began to darken. The dark night was about to arrive. This night the wind was very strong. The cold wind blew past the tea mountain and the grass hut. That trace of coldness seemed to penetrate through the walls, giving people the illusion that it was not summer but winter. The sound of the wind was especially mournful, like the mournful cry of a woman, echoing in the night. It was already dark outside. Lu Chen lay motionless on the bed in the grass hut. His eyes were closed as if he had already fallen asleep. Even the cold wind outside could not wake him up. Suddenly there was a faint sound mixed with the cold wind. In the dark world, it was like careful footsteps, slowly approaching the grass hut. In the wind, a few strands of thatch on the roof were blown up, shivering. A black shadow appeared from the darkness and walked towards the thatched hut. His footsteps were light and heavy, like a phantom in the night wind. When he reached the door of the hut, the black shadow suddenly stopped and stood still. The night wind blew bitterly, and the darkness seemed to cover the entire world. At this time, the tea mountain seemed to suddenly become abnormally sinister, terrifying, and tall. The shadow of the mountain was like a giant, about to crush down at any time. In the darkness, there seemed to be a sound of breathing that quickened, but also like a rapid heartbeat. In the silence, the black shadow seemed to raise a hand and touch the door. The night grew darker. Under the eaves of the grass hut, one could not see their fingers in front of them. They could only vaguely see that thick, ink-like shadow spreading over. Just as it was about to touch the door, suddenly in the darkness, the door suddenly opened, and at the same time, there was a clear roar. The shadow in the darkness seemed to be startled and froze for a moment. In this split second, There seemed to be a large mass of dark shadow spewing out from the grass hut, covering the shadow outside. Chapter 43. A hard and cold hand, like a poisonous snake, instantly grabbed the neck of the black figure. With a sudden force, accompanied by a painful moan and cry, the person outside the hut was dragged into the hut and fell to the ground. At the same time, in the deepest part of the darkness, a dark dagger, with a cruel and bloodthirsty aura, stabbed towards the heart of the figure. Someone panted in the darkness, like a demon laughing, but also like despair and fear, yearning for blood, to extinguish the trembling in the nightmare. Ah! Someone cried out, with a cry and fear, trembling like withered grass in the wind. The tide of darkness surged, surging in this lonely hut. The sinister and ruthless black dagger, pierced through the darkness, pierced through the wind, pierced through clothes, and directly stabbed towards her chest. His eyes were bright but cold. In the determination and killing intent, he saw the blurry outline of that face and heard that cry. The darkness suddenly stopped, like the tide suddenly solidifying in the air, all sound disappeared, and at that moment even blood seemed to stop flowing. The cold dagger pierced through her clothes and sank into her plump chest. If it went any deeper, it would be life and death. The world outside the house seemed to slowly return to normal, and it was as if he could hear the sound again. The wind was like a tide, whistling as it blew. That dagger still did not leave. She lay on the ground, her body cold, not daring to move. After an unknown amount of time, maybe it was just an instant, but it seemed as long as a lifetime, that snow-like coldness that pressed down on her chest, slowly lifted and retreated into the darkness. Pata! A spark exploded and then lit up the candles by the table. The dim yellow candlelight dispersed the darkness, adding a trace of warmth to this lonely hut. When the light landed on the ground, that figure turned her head, but it was Ding Dang. At this moment, she looked somewhat disheveled, her hair was messy, her clothes were untidy, and her face was frighteningly pale. She slowly sat up, looking at the man standing by the table and the dagger still in his hand. That was a black, dull dagger. Lu Qin turned around and looked at her silently. After a while, he walked over and closed the door of the hut. The mournful howling of the wind seemed to have lessened by a lot, and the chill seemed to have been blocked outside. Ding Dong's complexion became slightly better as she slowly crawled up from the ground, but her gaze towards Lu Qin was still somewhat fearful. After a while, she said in a low voice, "You almost killed me just now." Lu Qin was silent for a moment, then kept the black dagger, walked to the side and poured a bowl of water, passing it to Ding Dang, then calmly said, "You should not have thought of sneaking into my house at this time." Ding Dang slightly lowered her head, both hands hugging the bowl of water. She sat down on Lu Chen's bed and slowly sipped on it. Lu Chen walked to the table and pulled over a stool, sitting opposite Ding Dang. He did not say anything else, only sizing her up. Other than the previous fright, Ding Dang did not seem to have any other problems, but perhaps because she was a little tired, her complexion looked a little haggard. After a while, Ding Dang placed the bowl of water to the side and said, "I am too tired and am unable to walk down the mountain to the village, so I wanted to rest here for a while." Lu Chen looked at her, nodded his head and said, "Sure." There was a blanket on the bed and the blanket was still slightly warm. When Ding Dang laid down, she would think that not long ago, it should have been Lu Chen lying here. This place was not as comfortable as the bedroom at home, but in this dark night, it was still a warm place that made people feel at ease. Lu Chen stood in front of the bed, covering her with the blanket. The two of them looked at each other, his eyes reflecting the light from the candlelight. Ding Dong's body slightly trembled under the blanket. It was a kind of faint trembling feeling, but after a while, Lu Chen turned around and walked to the table, blowing out the candle flame. The darkness surged and his figure became indistinct. He walked to the side of the bed and then laid down on the ground beside the bed. That night they did not speak much, and for some reason they did not talk about the usual joking and frivolous words, and were even more silent. In the darkness, who knows how long, suddenly Ding Dong's faint voice sounded out, "Are you asleep?" "Not yet." Lu Chen's voice came from the ground beside the bed. Ding Dang was silent for a while and then said, "Are you cold?" "Not bad, not cold." "Don't you want to ask me why I am like this, or why I always want to go up the mountain?" This time Lu Chen did not reply. He was silent in the darkness for a while and then said, "If you don't say, then I won't ask." Ding Dang once again became silent, and for a long period of time, there was no sound in the grass hut, but because it was too quiet, it was as if they could faintly hear each other's breathing, or maybe, they could even hear their own heartbeats. Ding Dang slowly curled up under the bedding, her hands wrapped around her chest as if she felt a little cold. After a while, she suddenly said in a soft voice, "I want to talk to you about something, okay?" Luchin, okay. Ding dang, I went up the mountain to meet someone at the Dragon Lake. Luchin, okay. Ding dang, that person is Li Ji. Luchin, ding dang, the spirit stones I borrowed from you along with my own savings were all given to him so that he could have a chance to enter the Thousand Autumns Gate. Luchin, ding dang, he and I have made a promise to marry each other. He said that his talent is extraordinary, and as long as he has the chance to see the immortal mirror, he will definitely be accepted into the Thousand Autumns Gate. When that time comes, he will come to take me up the mountain, and from then on, we will cultivate the great Tao together and we will be immortals together. Luchin, you believe him? Ding dang, yes. In the darkness, Luchin turned his body sideways, his gaze fixed on an unknown place in the darkness. After a while he said softly, "You're tired, go to bed early." Ding dang was silent for a moment, then said, "Okay." The Immortal City was a huge city, and it was the liveliest and most bustling place in the Middle-earth continent. Tens of millions of people lived in and around this magnificent city. Zheng Xianming was here, and it had been the ruler of this city for many years. It was the symbol of the Middle-earth continent's greatest power, but even with such a fearsome colossus as Zheng Xianming, in reality, it couldn't completely control this revered giant city. Fuyunji Zhang Jiuping's death caused a huge commotion in Zheng Xianming, so much so that a few terrifying true monarchs were enraged. But to this huge city, this matter didn't have much to do with most people. Chapter 44. The Three Realms Divine Sect had been on the decline for many years. Even if it still had some reputation, even if it could occasionally stir up some bad things, at least from the situation in the past 10 years, this sect was no longer on the stage. Hence, the tense and somber atmosphere was actually only within the True Immortal Alliance. In fact, most of it was only on the side of the Floating Clouds Agency. Of course, the order to investigate the Three Realms Divine Sect had already been issued by the higher-ups. Various forces had also started to move slowly. There were activities in the open and in the dark. However, at least on the surface, the Immortal City didn't seem to have changed much. At most, it was just a topic of conversation after a meal. The former inspector of Fuyunji, Old Lu, finally handed over all his responsibilities on this day. He could be considered to have completely retired from his post. His feelings were a little complicated. He was a little disappointed but also a little happy. He was happy because being able to work in Zheng Xianming was the most desirable and best choice for most cultivators, especially the disciples of the small and medium-sized sections. Here, they had the opportunity to get better resources and better opportunities, as well as the respect that they usually couldn't get. On the other hand, he was disappointed because of the price of those things. Many times they had to sweat, bleed, or even risk their lives. But after he retired, all of that would come to an end. Old Lu didn't know many people in Fuyunji, but he still had a few acquaintances. Therefore, on this day, everyone gathered together to drink for him. Unfortunately, the young man that he had high hopes for, Bianjia, had already left Immortal City a few days earlier due to his duties. Therefore, he couldn't send him on his last journey before he retired. Old Lu was a little regretful, but it was also a very enjoyable thing to drink and chat with his other old brothers in Fuyunji. He was almost at the end of his journey, and most of the time he had already seen through things, so he didn't have to hold back when he spoke. After drinking too much, he even half smiled and half seriously said some words that he wouldn't normally dare to say to his immediate superior who came to visit him. That superior was a woman. She was usually stern and strict, but on this night she just laughed it off and didn't take it to heart. On the contrary, the faces of the people around the table changed. They looked at Old Lu as if they were looking at a monster, and no one spoke. Old Lu sensed something, but the alcohol got to his head and he couldn't react in time, so he didn't think about it anymore. When he slowly woke up, it was already the morning of the next day, and it was time for him to leave the Immortal City. That morning, Old Lu broke out in cold sweat as he sat on the bed, and then he packed his bag and ran away. He didn't dare to stay in the Immortal City for a moment longer, and he didn't even care about his agreement with his old brothers to send him off. Fortunately, he didn't encounter any accidents on his way out of the city. It seemed that the woman with the nickname Black Widow wasn't angry for once. Old Lu felt lucky in his heart, but at the same time he was wary of his own stupidity. He had been cautious all his life, but he actually did such a stupid thing before he passed away. As these thoughts crossed his mind, He walked out of the grand and majestic city gate of Immortal City and gradually walked away. On the bustling and crowded street outside the city, people came and went. Amidst the silence, amidst the hustle and bustle, a shrill cry suddenly came from afar. Many people did not even have time to react. However, there were also people who heard the voice and clearly repeated it when they investigated. On that morning as usual, old Lu, who was rushing out of the city, suddenly disappeared, and the last cry he left behind was like this: "Blood Warbler." However, the ordinary people didn't know the truth. Zhengxianming Fiyunji, the beloved general under true Lord Tianlan, wielded great power in Fiyunji, and even in the enormous Zhengxianming there was a famous leader, the Hall Master, who was a woman called Shuiying, nicknamed Blood Warbler. At daybreak, Ding Dang and Lu Qin woke up. Without saying anything more, Ding Dang quickly left the place. Lu Qin sent her to the intersection and didn't continue down the mountain. He looked at the back of the woman who left in a hurry and remained silent. When she was on the mountain, did something happen? Why did she look so weak and helpless last night? Was she afraid of Lu Qin, afraid of death, or afraid of something else? After that, she didn't say anything and Lu Qin didn't ask again. The days quickly calmed down again, or perhaps on the surface, these days never changed, forever repeating day after day. Ding Dang didn't come to find Lu Qin again. That night in the darkness, she used a slightly trembling voice to say those words, as if they were just murmurs in the darkness, quietly drifting in the wind. Lu Qin continued to live alone, occasionally going to the small tavern at the foot of the mountain to drink, but most of the time he stayed in his grass hut. Every day he would try to recultivate on his own, but the aptitude of the 5 elements divine disc that he had been reborn with was a little too poor, making his path of cultivation extremely difficult. The spiritual power in his body was next to nothing, and he didn't make much progress with each day. However, Lu Qin didn't lose heart. On the contrary, he continued to persevere, and began to walk on this path that he had walked before. As for the dark side of the divine disc, after that night, he didn't touch it again. Because when he thought back to the situation in the darkness, Lu Qin clearly felt, at least at that moment, when the darkness was at its most turbulent, he faintly felt that he lost control of his own mind and body. And that black spiritual power from the 2 attempts was almost certain to be related to slaughter and death. Lu Qin didn't fear blood, nor did he fear the darkness. In his silent years, these 2 things had always accompanied him through those days. However, if it was spiritual energy that could only be obtained through killing and death, this kind of thing still exceeded the limits of Lu Qin's heart. Moreover, there was an unremarkable but important matter that made Lu Qin subconsciously keep a little distance from the divine disk of darkness. It was a pot of strange sour rabbit meat. Old Lu died. The hot sun shone outside the house. Although it was a little cooler inside the pub, it wasn't much better. The sweat on old Ma's head was still seeping out. He wiped it with a towel, half covering his face, and said in a flat tone to Lu Qin, "How did he die?" The day he left Immortal City, he disappeared outside the east gate of Immortal City. Someone heard shouting, but no one found him. When he was found again, old Lu was already a corpse, thrown in the black pine forest outside the west gate. Even his corpse had been half-eaten by wild beasts. Lu Qin was silent for a while and asked, "Was it the devil cult?" Old Ma sighed and put down the towel in his hand. Then he said, "During this period of time, 2 patrol envoys of the Floating Clouds Division have died consecutively. Zhang Jioping was definitely killed by the devil cult, but old Lu can't be sure for now. For the time being, there are no traces of the devil cult on him." Chapter 45. Seeing that old Ma was hesitant to speak, Lu Qin raised his eyebrows and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma laughed bitterly and said, "This matter is quite. It is said that on the day old Ma disappeared, many people on the main road outside the Immortal City heard that exclamation at the same time, but what old Lu shouted was not cursing the evil sect, he called out Hall Master Shui's name." Lu Chen's expression changed slightly and said in a low voice, "Shuiying?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes. The atmosphere in the Immortal Alliance is a little tense and Fiyunji is also in chaos. As for Hall Master Shui, I heard that he has been in seclusion for a few days." Lu Qin thought for a while and shook his head. Although Shui Ying's temper is not good, she should not be a spy of the evil sect. Old Ma was a little surprised and looked at Lu Qin and said, "I remember that you have never met her before, how can you be so sure?" Lu Qin said indifferently, 10 years ago she participated in the battle in the desolate valley." Old Ma became silent and after a while, he nodded and did not speak anymore. There was no need to talk about the treacherous situation in the Immortal City and the unfathomable dangers, but it seemed to be too far away and did not seem to affect the small mountain village thousands of miles away. The villagers of Qingshitang village were still living quietly, working hard for the illusory dream in most people's hearts. On the morning of the 6th of August, when Lu Qin was going down the mountain as usual, he once again met Ding Dang, who was walking up the mountain. It was different from when they met a few days ago. Lu Qin could tell that Ding Dang did not seem to be in a good condition today. Her appearance was still beautiful, but her expression seemed to be a little haggard. She was no longer in high spirits but seemed to have something on her mind. Even when Lu Qin brushed past her, she who had been slightly bowing her head did not notice. For some reason, Lu Qin did not call out to her and only silently watched the woman walk up the hill and walk alone towards the distant Dragon Lake at the top of the mountain. Wasn't that a huge gamble? Was the wager his entire life? The figure in the distance looked extremely fragile and lonely. After she disappeared into the forest, Lu Qin silently turned around and walked back to the village. But for some reason that lonely figure still lingered in his heart when he walked into the tavern. There was always a strange feeling of unease that he couldn't get rid of. Old Ma saw him and quickly walked over. His face was solemn with a hint of nervousness. He closed the door and pulled Lu Qin to sit down. Lu Qin frowned and looked at the nervous fatty. "What's wrong?" Old Ma took a deep breath and lowered his voice. "Something's not right." A glint flickered in the depths of Lu Qin's eyes as he said, "Speak." Old Ma replied, "I've just received news that 3 people from the Fuyun Agency's shadow guards have died in succession during this period of time. They were all killed by someone." He raised his head and glanced at Lu Qin. There was a hint of dryness in his voice as he said in a low voice, "Among the people who died, one of them was the shadow that Zhang Jiuping was in charge of. The other 2 were contacted by old Lu in the past few years." Lu Qin was silent. He sat at the table and did not speak. Old Ma looked at him for a while and said softly, "There's still no news that directly points to the 3 Realms divine sect as the culprit, but it's them. They would rather kill the wrong person than let them go." Lu Qin suddenly interrupted him. Old Ma paused for a moment. Then he gritted his teeth and said, "If that's the case, we can't just sit and wait for death. Before he finished, his voice suddenly lowered as if he thought of something. At the same time, Lu Qin also shook his head slightly and said, "There's something strange about Fuyunji. There's either a traitor or they're being watched. We can't look for them." Old Ma nodded slowly. His face gradually calmed down. He frowned for a moment and said, "You're right. I'll arrange this. Let's leave this place." Lu Qin asked, "How long?" Old Ma said, 3 days, 2 days at the earliest." Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, "If we suddenly disappear, it'll mean that there's something strange here. It might attract the attention of the evil sect's demons. I'm just a fugitive. What about you?" Old Ma snorted and said, "I'm fine. Didn't I survive a few years ago? Moreover, not many people in the Immortal Alliance know my background. There are at most 2 people." Lu Qin glanced at him and said, "Who is it?" Old Ma said, "Perfected Lord Tianlan and Hall Leader Shui." Lu Qin nodded and stood up. He said, "Arrange it as soon as possible." Old Ma said, "Okay." Walking out of the tavern, it was still sunny and hot outside. The quiet mountain village under the sun seemed especially peaceful and quiet. Lu Qin looked around. He had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. He had lived here for 10 years and knew everything here. Although the villagers here were not all good people and he was just acquainted with them, he still unexpectedly felt a trace of warmth when he looked at the village. However, he quickly swept this trace of emotion out of his mind. He turned around and walked towards the thatched hut. In that lonely house at the foot of the mountain, he also had some things to tidy up. Lu Qin's footsteps paused when he walked past the large pagoda tree. He glanced at the old fisherman who was fishing and smiled. In the end, he did not go up to say anything and instead walked over. The cicadas screamed with all their might behind him, as if they were going crazy against the hot weather. When walking up the mountain path, Lu Qin looked up at the tea mountain. All these years, perhaps the only person who was really close to him was that woman. Unfortunately, she had bet on someone else. But that was good. No matter what, someone else had a better future than him. There was a bitter smile at the corner of his mouth, but in the next moment, his smile suddenly froze because at this moment he suddenly saw somewhere on the peak of Tea Mountain in the distance, there was suddenly a flash of fiery light, and then after waving for a moment, it quickly disappeared. Was that a torch in the daytime? If this was a gamble, he had to bear the consequences himself. Lu Qin walked into his thatched hut and began to pack his things. However, as he walked around the hut, he picked up and put things down. After a while, he sat down on the side of the bed and sighed, thinking that he really had nothing to worry about. He sat silently for a while, his eyes calm but inadvertently at a loss, but he quickly calmed down. After a while he suddenly stood up, opened the door and walked out, walking towards the tea mountain. The spirit tea trees all over the mountain swayed in the wind. The green leaves were still full of life, as if they were not frightened by the scorching sun even in the height of summer. Chapter 46. Wuxia walked on the mountain road and gradually climbed higher. The thatched hut behind him and the village at the foot of the mountain gradually became smaller. The stream that flowed through Qingshitang village also looked like a long, thin snake. The tea mountain was very quiet. There were birds chirping and the sound of the wind, but it was still very quiet. There were many mountain roads, and from time to time there would be forks in front of him. Wuxia would occasionally stop and think carefully, then look up at the top of the tea mountain, recalling the direction of the torch that suddenly appeared not long ago, and then continue to walk forward. About an hour later he stopped on a mountain road that was close to the top of the mountain. About 10 feet in front of him, under a spirit tea tree, there was a withered branch that had fallen. It was charred black as if it had been burned. Wuxia stared at the branch for a moment, then walked over and squatted down beside it. He picked it up and carefully examined it for a moment, then suddenly touched the charred end of the withered branch. There was still some residual warmth on the branch. He silently stood up and looked around at the ground, the grass and the forest. There were messy footprints, wild grass that had been stepped on, broken branches and broken leaves. The mountain wind blew, and the mountain peak seemed to be a bit chilly. Wuxia stood in the same place for a while, then continued to walk forward expressionlessly, towards the back of the tea mountain, in the direction of the west foot of the mountain peak. Splash! A burst of splashing sound suddenly came from the clear water stream, but it startled Lao Yu under the big locust tree. He looked up and saw that the fishing float in the stream was shaking violently. He was startled at first, then overjoyed, and with a cry of surprise, he hurriedly reeled in the line. But the fishing line was first taut, then suddenly pulled back violently. A strong force suddenly came, and after a muffled sound, the fishing line broke in the middle. Lao Yu involuntarily took 2 steps back, his heart sinking. Just as he was about to continue doing something, he saw a black shadow suddenly flash in the depths of the water, and in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. There was a burst of ripples on the stream, like wind blowing over the surface of the water, but soon it slowly calmed down. In the clear water, there was no longer any abnormality, it was exactly the same as before. Ah! The old fisherman growled angrily, stomping his feet and pounding his chest in frustration. At this moment he suddenly heard a voice behind him. Someone said with a gentle smile, "What a pity. That seems to be a big fish." Old Yu turned around and saw a young man standing under the large pagoda tree behind him. He was dressed in a long white robe and had delicate features. He held a folding fan in his hand and there was a painting of mountains and rivers drawn on the surface of the fan. Even though it was a hot summer day, he still looked somewhat elegant and otherworldly. This young man's smile was very gentle, and he was also very good-looking. At first glance he made people feel very comfortable and pleasing to the eye. After Old Yu saw this young man, his first impression was that this guy seemed to look better than Li Ji from a few days ago. However, he had never seen this person before. He didn't seem to be from Qingshitang village, and Old Yu wasn't someone who was good at socializing. He frowned and turned his head away without a word. He continued to pick up the fishing rod and reel the fishing line. The young man behind him wasn't in a hurry. He looked at Old Yu with a smile and said after a while, "Old sir, have you been fishing here for a long time?" Old Yu didn't want to answer, but the young man's attitude was too good. It made him feel a little apologetic, so he subconsciously agreed. The young man smiled and fanned himself twice. He looked at the sky and said, "Although it's quite uncomfortable on such a hot day, I heard that some fish are different when it's hot and will float to the surface. That's probably what happened just now." Old Yu was shocked. He turned around to look at him and said, "Is that true?" The young man smiled and closed his fan. He cupped his hands and said, "I only heard about it. I don't dare to guarantee it." Old Yu thought about it and nodded. "All right, I'll continue fishing." The young man nodded with a smile and didn't say anything. He just stood under the shade of the big locust tree as if this was a leisurely life. Old Yu didn't have any aversion to it. After all, the young man didn't disturb him while he was fishing. It was just that when he occasionally looked around, he would suddenly notice that there were more figures in some corners and roads of the village in the distance. Those people's faces seemed a little unfamiliar. Unlike Lu Qin, who had nothing to worry about when the plump old ma packed his luggage in the back hall of his small tavern, he found that there seemed to be a lot of things that belonged to him, or rather he wanted to take with him. He packed one thing after another and packed one bag after another until even he couldn't stand it anymore. He stared at the pile of luggage in the room and muttered with a depressed expression, "Forget it. If that guy sees this, I'm afraid he'll scold me to death." He shook his head with a look of regret and pain on his face. He sighed and kicked away a few bags of luggage. He picked up a few more and put them aside. After a while, there were only 3 bags left in the middle of the room. After that, old Ma stopped cleaning up. Instead, he walked to a wall and pushed open a cabinet. Then, his hand groped in the corner for a moment, and a secret door opened. A bulging bag was lying in this secret compartment. From time to time, there was a slight sound of impact as if there were many small stones in it. Old Ma carefully lifted the bag with a satisfied expression. He touched it gently with his hand and hugged it hard. Then he walked back to the middle of the room and stuffed it into the depths of one of the luggage. After doing this, old Ma breathed a sigh of relief and showed a satisfied expression. He looked around and was about to leave the room. Suddenly, there were a few clear knocks on the door of the tavern in front of him. Knock, knock, knock. Accompanying the knocks was the gentle voice of a young man. He seemed to be smiling as he said, "Is anyone there?" Old Ma turned around and looked at the entrance of the tavern. He didn't know why, but he suddenly frowned. The sun shone down with thousands of golden rays. It was incomparably hot, but the water of the Dragon Lake behind Tea Mountain was still as calm as a mirror. It was like a beautiful gem embedded in the mountain. When people approached the lake, they would feel a trace of moisture and coolness that was rare in this hot weather. The mountain was green and the water was blue. The mountain peak was reflected in the water, and the lake and mountains were beautiful. Between the mountains and rivers, it was a peaceful place. However, at this moment, there was a burst of noise coming from the lakeside. 2 figures stood by the lakeside, a man and a woman facing each other. Chapter 47. Behind Tea Mountain, Dragon Lake, lakeside. The man was handsome and the woman was beautiful. They were supposed to be a match made in heaven, but for some reason they were glaring at each other, arguing about something. The woman was Ding Dang and the man was Li Ji, who had joined the Thousand Autumns Gate a few days ago. At this moment, Ding Dang looked to be in a sorry state. Her clothes and one side of her sleeves had traces of being torn. Her hair was also a little messy. A strand of her hair was slightly slanted, falling onto her snow-white cheeks. On the other hand, Li Ji did not seem to have any abnormalities, but his eyebrows were furrowed, his face was filled with anger. He stared at Ding Dang, his mouth was filled with suppressed anger, and he roared, why do you have so many words? Didn't I already tell you many times? Welcoming you into the sect can't be rushed, it has to be done slowly." Ding Dang laughed coldly, her eyes as sharp as knives. She said hatefully, "Who do you think you're trying to fool? When you took my spirit stones, everything was agreed upon. As long as you joined the Thousand Autumns Gate, you would immediately welcome me into the sect and we would cultivate together. It's only been a few days and you're already going back on your word?" Li Ji's face turned green and he said angrily, "How can it be so easy? I'm not the only one in charge. What's more, Elder Su died a horrible death to the demonic sect not long ago. Now the entire sect is in a frenzy, and everyone is chasing the demonic sect's murderer. How can I bring this up?" Ding Dong's expression didn't change and she only laughed coldly. "You make it sound so nice, but do you think I'm a country bumpkin? I've already asked around and the Thousand Autumns Gate can't do anything about it. We can only report it to Zheng Xianmeng and ask the Immortal Alliance to investigate. Now that the Thousand Autumns Gate has taken care of Elder Su's funeral matters, there are no other restrictions. Didn't your gate master just accept a new disciple a few days ago?" Li Ji's expression froze and he was speechless for a moment. Ding Dang bit her lips and stomped her foot. "If you insist on refusing, then return the spirit stones to me and help me gather the remaining 1,000 spirit stones according to our original agreement. Let me take a trip to the immortal mirror. Whether I live or die, whether I become an immortal or a mortal, I will leave it to fate." Li Ji clenched his fists tightly, his face flushed red as he said, Where do I get so many spiritual stones now?" Ding Dang stared at him for a long time before saying, "This won't do, that won't do. Today you are the only one who has entered the immortal sect and cultivated the immortal Tao. Your future is bright, but I have to stay in this small village in the mountains and suffer the torment of others. Every day I look forward to seeing you, but it is hard for me to see you. Do you know how it feels? Saying the last sentence, Ding Dong's eyes were red and tears flowed down her cheeks. Li Ji gritted his teeth and said, I said this matter cannot be rushed. Give me some more time. Ding Dong rubbed her eyes. She did not know why, but when she looked at Li Ji, her expression slowly softened. Her eyes had a trace of mournful sorrow as she said in a low voice, Li Lang, my feelings for you, could it be that you really do not understand? Li Ji lowered his head and did not say a word. Ding Dong took a step forward and said, From the first time I saw you, I fell in love with you. From the moment you drew me those paintings, I wanted to be with you for the rest of my life. For you, I am willing to do anything, do you know that? She sobbed softly and said, I do want to cultivate, but I want to be with you even more. The two of us will cultivate together in the future and be free and unfettered. We'll live forever and never grow old, and we'll be immortal companions. Is that okay? Okay. Saying that, she reached out and grabbed Li Ji's hand, hugging it to her chest, and looked at him with a sorrowful expression. Li Ji raised his head, and the expression on his face changed a few times. Hesitation, apprehension, joy, yearning, sadness, fear, and all sorts of other emotions flashed across his face in that short moment. On his palm, the warmth of the girl's body came, and the familiar feeling of soft skin. His expression suddenly became cold, and looking at Ding Dong's eyes, he said coldly, How many men's hands have you held like this? Ding Dong's body suddenly trembled as if she had fallen into an ice cellar, and even her hands turned cold in that instant. She took a step back, but her body suddenly stopped. It was Li Ji who had grabbed her hand and tightly grabbed it. He opened his eyes wide, and for some reason, his expression looked somewhat sinister. He took a step forward, and in an instant he got close to Ding Dong and stared at her. His gaze was as sharp as a blade, as if he wanted to see through this girl's deepest heart. Even his words at this moment seemed very sharp. Before me, how many men have you slept with? Ding Dong's entire body started to tremble, her face was snow white, and her lips were trembling non-stop. Her chest was heaving up and down intensely, but it was as if she was unable to breathe, and only tears kept flowing crazily. She looked at Li Ji and shook her head with all her might, but not a single word came out of her mouth. Li Ji clenched his teeth, and that handsome and extraordinary face of his was somewhat distorted. He angrily looked at Ding Dong and suddenly swung his hand, throwing Ding Dong's hand away, and angrily roared, You slut, why did you lie to me? Ding Dong's body involuntarily staggered a few steps back, her face was covered in tears, and she cried out, It's not like that, I really like you, I really want to live with you for the rest of my life. Who wants to live with you for the rest of my life? Li Ji shouted, interrupting Ding Dong's words. His eyes looked a little red, and he gritted his teeth and said, A lowly and shameless girl like you, a whore who can sleep with anyone, dares to dream about the immortal Tao scram. Ding Dong seemed as if she couldn't even stand steadily, and in an instant she sat on the ground and her face was pale. Looking at Li Ji, she seemed to be somewhat incoherent. How can you be like this? At that time when you asked me for money and said those sweet nothings to me, you weren't like this. Li Ji kicked a stone beside him, and it directly fell into the dragon lake, and with a putong sound, it seemed that at this moment his heart was also filled with anger. He pointed at Ding Dong, unable to restrain his anger as if he was staring at a life-and-death enemy, and loudly said, Why didn't you tell me clearly at that time? You used that dirty money to pave the road for me, but it was all for yourself, right? Ding Dong laughed bitterly, looking at that man. Her face was still as pale as paper, and her tears did not stop, but her eyes seemed to have brightened a little. In that sorrow, she quietly looked at Li Ji and then said softly, Li darling, I remember that you should be very happy to take that money, and pave a road for yourself to ascend to heaven. Chapter 48. Li Ji clenched his fists once more. His face was ashen, but he didn't say anything for a long time. Ding Dong looked at him mournfully, her eyes gradually filled with despair. She didn't know where she got the strength from, but she slowly crawled up from the ground. The mountain breeze blew, and her clothes fluttered in the wind. Her pink dress was like a peach blossom in spring, beautiful and delicate. Her hand lightly brushed her face, wiping away her tears, but she couldn't wipe them clean. Her white fingers picked up her loose hair and placed it beside her ear, making her look more tidy and beautiful. Under the sunlight, the peach blossom-like woman trembled slightly in the wind. It was as if she was at her most beautiful and desolate before withering. she softly said, "Li, do you dislike me?" Li Ji didn't say anything. Ding Dang stared at him in a daze. After a while, she slowly lowered her head and said, "I know." Li Ji snorted and suddenly said, "Don't pretend to be so pitiful. Do you think I don't know what you're thinking when you suddenly lit a torch at the top of the mountain? Isn't there a lover at the bottom of the mountain that you're calling up? These days you've been cuckolding me countless times." As he spoke, his face became incomparably angry as he stared fixedly at Ding Dang. Ding Dang shook her head, her face pale. "I didn't do anything wrong. But if you must think that way, there's nothing I can do. If you don't want me, She seemed to be in so much pain that she couldn't speak. After a while, she gritted her teeth and said, "If it wasn't for you, I would still want to cultivate. Give me back my spirit stones. At worst, we'll just become strangers." Li Ji angrily said, "Didn't I tell you just now? I don't have them now. 1,000 spirit stones is not a small amount. Wait for me for a while. At the latest, I'll return them to you in a year." Ding Dang put her hand on her chest and smiled sadly. "You also know that it's not a small amount. How can I wait for you for a year? I don't know what you'll be like by then. In short, I beg you to give me a way out. Either bring me up the mountain or give me back my spirit stones. I'll take a trip to the immortal mirror." "No." Ding Dang clenched her teeth and said, "If that's the case, then I'll risk it all and make a trip to South Pine Mountain." Li Ji was startled and his expression changed greatly. He shouted, "Slut! What do you want to do? Are you trying to make me the laughingstock of the entire clan so that I won't be able to raise my head in the future?" Ding Dang looked at Li Ji, her lips trembling a few times. In the end, she gave a perplexed smile, turned around and walked towards the mountain path. Li Ji shot forward like an arrow, grabbing Ding Dong's shoulder. He angrily said, "What are you trying to do? Are you crazy? Why must you force me like this?" "I didn't force you." Ding Dang pushed him away and continued to walk forward, choking with tears. I am just an ordinary girl. I don't think so much. I just want." Before she could finish her sentence, Ding Dong's body suddenly stiffened and she stopped moving. The lakeside of the Dragon Lake suddenly quietened down. It was as if even the slightest breeze had suddenly disappeared. Slowly, Tink lowered her head and looked at her body. A bloody blade had pierced through her abdomen. Dark red drops of blood slowly dripped down from the blade, falling onto the muddy ground below, mixing with the muddy mud, forming a dark color. An intense pain surged from her abdomen like a tidal wave, as if tearing her delicate body apart, crushing her heart. She slowly turned her head. With a trace of despair and disbelief, she looked at the man behind her. "You." She pointed at Li Ji, crying out in a low voice. Li Ji growled, pulling out the blade, causing blood to splatter everywhere. Ding Dang wailed, her body trembled and was about to fall, when Li Ji suddenly grabbed her arm again. His right hand was like an Azura demon, and that cold blade once again pierced into Ding Dong's chest. Ugh! Ding Dong's entire body shrunk as if she was a child afraid of pain. Her pale face was devoid of blood, and she looked at the man beside her in despair. Li Ji once again pulled out the blade and took a step back. Fresh blood gushed out, and instantly dyed half of Ding Dong's body red. Ding Dang slowly fell down. Her face still had a look of disbelief, but in the end, her face slowly calmed down. She only quietly looked at Li Ji not far away, her eyes filled with sorrow and pity. Suddenly there was the sound of the wind, suddenly there was an angry roar, and suddenly a figure rushed out from the mountains, in a moment rushing in front of Li Ji, knocking him away from Ding Dong's side. Li Jiren was startled in mid-air, but he immediately turned his hand and stabbed the blood-stained blade towards the figure that was rushing towards him. The person who rushed out was Lu Qin. Facing the blade, he dodged to the side and punched towards Li Ji's face. Li Ji had already been a disciple of the Thousand Autumns sect for a period of time, and even though it could not be said to be a small success, it could be said that he had made some progress in the lowest realm of cultivation, the qi refining realm. No matter what, he was still stronger than the average person. So when he saw that the person was the villager from Qingshitang village at the foot of the mountain, he immediately laughed coldly, steadied his body and raised his arm. As long as he blocked this sneak attack, then he would be able to kill this mortal without any cultivation. It would be a piece of cake. However, at this moment he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right thigh. In an instant he felt as if his body was being torn apart. Li Ji screamed and retreated in terror. Looking down, he saw that when Lu Chen's fist was about to hit his face, his other hand had viciously grasped a black dagger. Moreover, it had mysteriously and silently avoided all of his senses, directly stabbing into his thigh. Immediately after, it viciously pulled to the side, fiercely cutting out a ghastly wound. This kind of method, this kind of evil, it was really something he had never heard of before. He obviously did not have any cultivation and was just a normal person, but in reality in an instant he was almost defeated. Li Ji could not stand steadily and directly fell to the ground. For a moment his eyes looked at the black short sword in Lu Chen's hand that was like a devil, and actually had some traces of fear. Lu Chen still wanted to go forward, but suddenly from behind he heard Ding Dang's voice. Lu Chen. Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment, looking at the frightened Li Ji. He immediately put away the short sword, walked to Ding Dang's side and hugged her body. In the blink of an eye, blood gushed out, staining the clothes on his chest. Lu Chen did not say anything, only lowering his head to look at Ding Dang's body. His gaze swept across the girl's bloody stomach, and then looked at the wound on her chest. Ding Dang trembled. Lu Chen silently hugged her tighter. Ding Dang looked at him with some difficulty and said in a low voice, "My injury? Can you still save me?" Lu Chen hugged her, and after a moment of silence he slowly shook his head. Ding Dang began to cry. She cried in grief, her tears like pearls falling down, landing on her bloody body. After a moment she looked at Lu Chen with hazy teary eyes, like an innocent child carrying her last hope, stretching out her bloody hands, and lightly and weakly grabbed onto Lu Chen's clothes, leaning her head on his chest, choking with sobs. Even her voice was trembling as she said, Am I going to die?" Lu Chen hugged her tightly, meeting her gaze. After another moment of silence he said in a low voice, "Yes." Chapter 49. After the peach blossoms bloom in spring, they will eventually wither, falling from the branches into the wind and dust, turning into mud and dust, thus never to be seen again. Just like life, cannot keep your youthful smile, beauty and charm. We must part in the end. When the mountain breeze blew, the lake rippled, the beautiful but haggard girl leaned on his chest, waiting for the final farewell. Just like the spring wind was gone, the peach blossoms were about to fade. Just like that they quietly withered. She slightly turned her head, looking at the faraway Li Ji who had fallen to the ground. Her eyes seemed to have some complicated emotions. Then she retracted her gaze, landing on Lu Chen. Her face became more and more pale, but her expression gradually calmed down, as if she had finally accepted the final outcome. She even forced a laugh in a low voice. No one knew what she was laughing at. Was it Lu Chen, Li Ji or herself? "Hey." Ding Dong's voice was so soft that it was almost indistinct. She said to Lu Chen, Have you ever liked me?" Lu Chen looked at Ding Dang, thought for a moment and said, "I should have." Ding Dang laughed, although in the middle she violently coughed twice and said in a low voice, "Lying again. Why would the person who likes me say that I should or shouldn't?" Lu Chen did not say anything, only quietly listening. Ding Dang sighed, weakly leaning on his chest and then said, "I like that person, but it's a pity that I misjudged him." Lu Chen said, "Don't talk anymore, rest for a while." Ding Dang ignored him, lightly panting for a while, then said, "Lu Chen, I'm about to die, can you promise me one thing?" Lu Chen looked at her and said, "Speak." Ding Dang laughed somewhat miserably, then turned her head to look at Li Ji, looking at the man with a face filled with fear. At this moment he was no longer as confident as before, but a trace of gentleness surfaced in her eyes, and then she said in a low voice, "I beg you to let him go." Lu Chen stared at Ding Dang. After a moment he said, "He caused you to become like this, he looked down on you, he also—" Ding Dang shook her head and did not refute anything, only saying one sentence, "I still like him." Lu Chen's voice came to an abrupt halt. He didn't say anything else and only silently looked at the woman in his arms. In the end he softly said, "Is it worth it?" Ding Dong's hand that was grabbing onto his clothes slowly loosened, as if the last of her strength was gradually disappearing. However, she seemed to be much more relaxed, with a gentle smile on her face. It was as if she was at her most beautiful age and her most gentle dream had finally come true, to have a person she loved to spend the rest of her life with, to be a celestial family, to be free and unfettered. She said to Lu Chen with a smile. With the dazzling blood and soul-stirring beauty of despair between life and death, she said, "Who cares?" Her head slowly drooped, but her gaze was still fixed on Lu Chen, and there was a hint of pleading in her gentleness. Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, "I know, I promise you." Ding Dang smiled, as if the last bit of her burden had been lifted. She no longer looked at the two men beside her, and her gaze turned towards the Dragon Lake, looking at the green mountains and clear waters, the lake and the mountains. A breeze blew, and her beautiful hair gently fluttered in the wind, giving off a strange sense of gentleness. "What a beautiful lake. Ding Dang said in a low voice and then closed her eyes. On Tea Mountain by the Dragon Lake. Silence reigned. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen gently put down Ding Dong's gradually turning cold body, and then stood up, walking towards Li Ji. Li Ji pressed on the wound on his thigh and somewhat fearfully retreated. He was originally a young master of a rich family, and had never suffered since he was young. Even when his family fell, he still lived a much better life than most mortals. As for entering the Thousand Autumns sect to cultivate because the time was too short, he did not truly experience the fighting and killing of cultivators. He would kill in a frenzy, but he would also feel pain and fear under the blood. Don't come over, don't forget, you promised Ding Dang that you wouldn't kill me. Li Ji shouted loudly. As he shouted, Lu Chen walked in front of him, looked at him, and then without saying a word, suddenly struck the back of his neck. Li Ji's shout came to an abrupt stop, and his eyes rolled back, his body fell forward, and in an instant he fainted. When Li Ji woke up again, he discovered that the surrounding light had dimmed, and looking at the sky, it was already dusk. There was still a burning pain coming from the back of his head, causing Li Ji to grit his teeth and groan in pain. When he sat up, he immediately discovered that the person he was most afraid of had not left. Lu Chen was still standing by the Dragon Lake, but at this moment his clothes, other than the blood that was originally stained with Ding Dong's blood, there was also a lot of dirt and dust. In front of Lu Chen, on the land beside the Dragon Lake, there was already a newly built lone grave. There was no tombstone, no pine, only a new layer of soil, quietly covering the woman who had already been eternally asleep. The grave faced the lake, facing the mountains and the water, like a woman placing her love in this picturesque landscape, smiling but not saying a word. Lu Chen turned around and walked in front of Li Ji with large steps. Li Ji immediately dodged, and for some reason fear took control of his body. He clearly looked down on this person as a mere mortal, but at this moment he did not have the heart to resist at all and only shouted, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Lu Chen grabbed the front of his clothes and directly dragged him in front of the new grave, throwing him to the ground and coldly said, "Kowtow 3 times. I'll kowtow. I'll kowtow." Li Ji hurriedly replied, and at the same time secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Since he was allowed to kowtow, then for Ding Dong's sake he was spared his life. He heavily kowtowed, dong dong dong, 3 times, kowtowing deeply, and no one could say anything wrong. Then he straightened his body and said, "Is this enough? Let me go." Halfway through his sentence, a black light suddenly flashed past his eyes, and his voice was abruptly blocked in his throat. At that moment, Li Ji's heart suddenly contracted. He stared at Lu Chen in disbelief, and his entire body trembled. It was as if the black sword that came from the deepest part of the darkness was held in Lu Chen's hands, mercilessly and fiercely stabbing into his body. Flesh and blood were cut and blood splattered everywhere. Li Ji loudly cried out and rolled his body, wanting to escape to the side, but behind him, Lu Chen expressionlessly looked at him. A strange light flashed in his eyes. It was a black flame, like the flames of the 9 nether yellow springs, eating souls as food, maliciously looking down on the world. One hand grabbed his neck and the other hand grabbed the black short sword as if he was holding a pig. His face was filled with killing intent, and the sword fell, fiercely stabbing down again and again. One sword, one sword, one sword, one sword, one sword, one sword. He was like an evil spirit reborn from hell, cruelly and mercilessly appearing in this world, with a trace of madness and terrifying darkness. In the midst of the black flames, he used the black short sword to continuously stab into Li Ji's body, until all of his blood and life was squeezed out and crushed. Blood splattered in the air, dyeing Lu Chen's clothes red. The black flames burned wildly in the blood, like a crazy feast. "You promised to let me go." Li Ji, who had already become a bloody man in the last moments of his life, desperately said these trembling words to Lu Chen. At this moment, Lu Chen, who was covered in blood like a demon, tightly gripped the short sword and took a step back, looking straight into the eyes of this person who was about to die, his face as cold as ice, coldly watching as he painfully breathed his last. Then he slowly walked to the side of the new grave by the lake. He sat down, looking at the lake and the mountain as if speaking to himself, but also to the person in the grave. He said in a low voice, "Who cares?" Chapter 50. The setting sun was like blood, illuminating the sunset on the horizon. Under the setting sun, the Tea Mountain stood silently in the crisscrossing light and shadow. Even the tranquil Dragon Lake was illuminated by the twilight. There were still bloodstains on the ground, and a lone grave had been added to the lakeside. Everything seemed to have been cleaned up. What was left was to endure the wind, frost, rain and snow of the years to come. When the darkness silently fell, there was no longer a trace of anyone on the T-mountain. Only a figure in the distance was walking further and further away, slowly walking into the darkness. When he saw the village at the foot of the mountain again, it was already after nightfall. The strange and mournful wind blew on the T-mountain again, echoing like the wails of ghosts and the howls of wolves at the foot of the mountain. The night was like water and the darkness was like the tide. Hidden at the foot of the T-mountain, it made the grass hut seem especially lonely. Lucien walked down the mountain path. Apart from the bloodstains on his body, his expression had completely returned to normal. Those strange black flames had disappeared at some point, and it looked as if they had never appeared on his body in the first place. Not a single trace of them remained. He walked out of the hut and glanced at the village at the foot of the mountain before he entered. In the darkness of the night, the village was quiet. There was no light at all. It was as if the village had fallen into a deep sleep in this deep night. Lucien stood at the door of the grass hut and reached out to push the door. The wooden door creaked open, and the cold wind seemed to swirl behind him, whistling as it blew past. He took half a step into the hut, and his body paused at the threshold. In the darkness, the familiar grass hut was as usual. Everything was in its original place and everything had the familiar smell. Even the bed in the shadows of the hut looked the same as when he had left it in the morning. Lucien stood quietly for a moment, and then he raised his gaze to glance above his head. Silence reigned. Not even a speck of dust floated down, much less withered grass. In the darkness, Lucien's pupils suddenly contracted. Woo! A mournful gust of cold wind blew past like the wail of a ghost with a bone-chilling chill, even though it was a summer night. Standing at the door, Lucien seemed to suddenly think of something. He stretched sleepily, shook his neck, and then looked back at the village at the foot of the mountain. He calmly retracted his foot that had just crossed the threshold. Then, he rubbed his stomach as if he was in a hurry to use the toilet. He looked around and then walked into the dark forest at the side. The darkness of the night rose and fell like the tide, filling the surroundings of the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. The forest was gloomy, as if it was coldly watching Lucien's lonely figure. The hazy atmosphere spread with the darkness, drifting around the grass hut like a ripple. It was like a ripple of ripples. It flowed silently from all around, gathering towards the grass hut. Lucien walked to the edge of the forest and even opened his mouth to yawn. He was completely unaware that the darkness behind him, as thick as ink, was gradually approaching. In the wind there seemed to be a slight whistling sound mixed in the night. Suddenly the darkness suddenly flourished, like a calm river suddenly setting off a huge wave. The waves were turbulent, and the imposing manner was ferocious, with a hint of wildness and madness. And almost at the same time, even the moment before the darkness suddenly rose, Lucien, who was originally standing calmly at the edge of the forest with a hint of laziness, suddenly turned his body and directly pounced into the forest. In an instant, a burst of angry curses suddenly rang out. In the originally quiet and empty night, more than a dozen blurry shadows suddenly appeared, pouncing over from all directions. The snow-white light pierced through the deep darkness and refracted a chilling sharpness. It pierced through the void and slashed towards Lucien's figure. However, in that moment of danger, Lucien had already rushed into the forest one step ahead of it. Immediately, there was a burst of angry shouts in the forest, and the shadows swayed again. It turned out that there were actually shadows in the forest, but obviously not as many as outside. Or perhaps it was because they did not expect someone to rush in here, and were not well prepared, so there was some chaos in the forest. The shadows of knives and swords rose one after another, and the sound of the wind was mournful. Very soon there was a muffled groan, and in the dark corner of the shadow, blood suddenly appeared. Outside the forest, the shadowy figures didn't hesitate and all rushed into the forest, bringing with them a murderous aura that was as strong as a mountain. Even the forest seemed to be tainted with the smell of blood. The mountain wind blew and the forest shook violently, like a small boat shivering in the raging sea, but nothing could be seen inside. At night in Qingshitang village, it was mostly quiet and dark. But on this night the village seemed to be especially quiet and dark. The only light was in the small pub in the village. There was a candle on the table, a pot of wine and a cup. The young child was drinking by himself. He poured a cup, took a sip and shook his head. He smiled warmly and said to the side of his feet, "This wine is not good." The small pub was very quiet. Other than this young and gentle man, only old Ma was still here. He was still dressed the same as in the day. Because it was too hot, his upper body was bare, and he only wore a pair of large underpants. But at this moment he seemed to be in extreme pain and disheveled. His hands and feet were tightly tied by thick ropes, and he was thrown on the ground like a fat pig waiting to be slaughtered, just beside the young child. The sentence that the young child said just now was directed at old Ma. At this moment old Ma did not look good. His face was bigger than usual because of the swelling. There were bruises everywhere as if he had been beaten up badly. The corner of his mouth was cracked and bleeding. But compared to his body, these were not worth mentioning. On old Ma's white and plump body, there were no less than 7 to 8 large wounds that were about an inch deep and a foot long. They crisscrossed on his chest and abdomen, including his back, which was badly mutilated. It was difficult to find an intact piece of skin on his body. Below him, blood had gathered into a pool, and it seemed to be slowly seeping into the ground. At this moment old Ma seemed to be dying. He laid on the cold ground weakly. Other than his chest that was still moving up and down, only his eyes were barely open. He looked like he could die at any time. After hearing that sentence, old Ma's dazed eyes flickered. He lifted his head and actually smiled, although the muscles on his face were twitching when he smiled. He said, "This is the countryside, I can't help it." The young child smiled warmly and looked at old Ma with a hint of admiration in his eyes. He said, "So, have you thought about it?" Chapter 51. Old Ma mumbled something but no one could hear what he was saying. The young man shrugged his shoulders and said indifferently, "It's up to you. He's a dead man anyway. It doesn't matter if you don't know his identity." Speaking of this, he glanced at old Ma again and seemed to think of something. Suddenly he said with interest, "But, I'm a little curious. What kind of person and what kind of shadow could make you clench your teeth so tightly that you'd rather die than reveal the secret?" Under the dim candlelight, old Ma grinned, and the young man looked at him with a smile. Two completely different smiling faces stared at each other in an incomparably strange manner. The wind blew coldly outside the house and the night grew darker. At the foot of T Mountain, countless shouts rose and fell amidst the shrill sound of the wind. Most of the sounds came from the dark mountain forest, and there were also all kinds of saber lights and sword shadows mixed in. The battle was extremely intense. But because it was too dark, it was impossible to see what was happening in the forest from the outside. Even the figures flashing between the trees could not be seen clearly. But suddenly, at a certain moment, the sounds in this forest suddenly quieted down. All the clamor was like a cliff suddenly disappearing. It seemed extremely abrupt. The night was dark like ink, but also like the mouth of a ferocious monster full of malice. Gradually, footsteps sounded in the forest, breaking the sudden silence. Strange voices echoed in a low voice, as if they were communicating with each other. Some were angry and some were anxious. After a while, human figures flashed and someone walked out of the forest. It was a masked man who was covered in black. Behind him, there were many other men in black who wore the same clothes as him. Many of them were holding shiny weapons in their hands, and the red of some of the blades could even be seen on them. The air was filled with tension and killing intent, and at the same time, there was a faint smell of blood. "Where is he?" "I don't know. He suddenly disappeared." "What the hell?" "Search again. This forest has been searched carefully." "Did he escape to the mountains again?" "That's impossible. The guards outside didn't see that shadow at all." It looked like the leaders of the black-robed men were standing together, talking quickly and fiercely with each other. It seemed like they had different opinions and were even arguing with each other. After arguing for a while, the black-clothed men were finally divided into two groups. Half of them continued to search here, while the other half went down the mountain to the village. There were about 10 black-clothed men left at the foot of the mountain. They quickly dispersed, some searching the forest, some guarding the path up the mountain, and some returning to the thatched hut to rummage through the chests and cabinets. An uproar broke out under the night sky. One could tell that the black-clothed men were rather flustered and exasperated. Perhaps it was because such an accident had occurred while they were heavily surrounded, causing them to appear even more tyrannical. Not long after, a cry of surprise suddenly came from the thatched hut, as if someone had discovered something important. There was a hint of surprise in the voice. There was a sudden commotion among the black-clothed men outside the thatched hut. Several of them followed, including those who were searching in the forest. At this time, someone had already lit a torch in the thatched hut. Under the light of the torch, the people inside and outside the hut could clearly see that under the bed in the thatched hut, there was a flip-up board and a secret passage. This discovery made many black-clothed men very happy. As they spoke, someone had already carefully picked up a torch and began to explore the secret passage. At the same time, in the depths of the forest that had quietened down outside the hut, a figure suddenly stood up in a dark corner. There was a strange aura in the darkness. It was cold and had a hint of killing intent. In this corner, darkness was everywhere, but the figure seemed to be particularly thick, like ice that could not be melted. This figure took a step out and the face slowly appeared. It was Lu Qin. As his figure swayed, one could vaguely see that there seemed to be another figure lying on the ground behind him, but it was lying on the ground motionlessly. But the strangest thing was that at this moment, Lu Qin had changed into the black clothes worn by those black-clothed men. What was even more strange was that strange black flames were burning in his eyes. He gently raised his hands and there was a black cloth in his palms. Then, like those black-clothed men, he covered his face. Instantly, all traces of his appearance were covered, as if he had been one of those black-clothed men from the beginning. For some reason, even his temperament was so similar. He glanced at the thatched hut in the distance outside the forest and frowned slightly. In the quiet forest, he stood quietly. After a moment, he thoughtfully glanced in the direction of the village at the foot of the mountain. That shadow is a person who encountered an accident. After being seriously injured, his cultivation was crippled. He is almost no different from an ordinary person. A calm voice echoed in the small tavern. A few black-clothed men stood at the door, and lowered their heads to listen to the young man's words. When he spoke, he sounded very calm and there was no angry expression on his face. But for some reason, these black-clothed men looked a little afraid, and their bodies were trembling slightly. You, a dozen or so people, all of you are cultivators. You surrounded a mortal with no cultivation, and you actually came back to tell me that he escaped. The young man smiled as if amused by his own words. He said lightly, "That doesn't seem right." The man in the middle of the black-clothed men standing by the door, after hesitating for a moment, finally gathered his courage and said, "Young master, that guy is not an ordinary person. A few of our brothers fought with him. That person's attacks are fierce and his attacks are very fierce. He should not be underestimated." The young master sitting at the table furrowed his brows. It seemed that he didn't doubt the words of the black-clothed man's subordinate. A trace of suspicion appeared in his eyes as he muttered to himself, "What's going on? Could it be that those idiots in Zhangxiameng found fake news?" The group of black-clothed men did not dare to speak. Then, a clever gaze suddenly swept over the fat old Ma, who was lying on the ground in a very miserable state. He said, "Young master, why don't we interrogate this fat man again? He must know the news of that shadow." Old Ma tilted his head, and suddenly spat a mouthful of bloody saliva toward the door. He cursed loudly, "CKU. You can't catch someone, so you vent your anger on me? If you have the guts, go and catch that guy." Chapter 52. An ominous glint flashed in the black-clothed man's eyes and he took a vicious step forward. The young man frowned and there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. Just as he was about to speak, there was a sudden commotion outside the tavern. The young man's expression darkened as he shouted, "What is it?" A man in black ran in from outside the tavern and said anxiously, "The mountain is on fire." Everyone in the tavern was shocked and hurried to the door to take a look. Indeed, in the darkness of the night, 6 or 7 places on the Tea Mountain were on fire at the same time. The fires did not seem to be connected yet and did not seem too big. However, the flames were bright and burning fiercely. They rose with the howling of the mountain wind. It was obvious that it would not be long before the mountain was set ablaze. There was a moment of silence among the men in black. Suddenly, someone cursed and someone was about to rush up the mountain but was immediately stopped by the young man. He looked around and his expression turned cold for the first time. His voice also carried a hint of coldness as he said, "This place is less than 30 miles from South Pine Mountain. Once the mountain fire gets bigger, the Thousand Autumns Gate will definitely send people over to investigate. When that happens, there will be no time for you to mess around." The men in black were all silent. After a while, the young man laughed coldly and suddenly slapped the folding fan in his hand. He said in a low voice, "Set the house on fire. Kill the fatty in the tavern. Let's go." Very quickly in the silent night, the light of the fire quickly lit up the surrounding area, surrounding the tavern in the middle. From the effect of the fire, it was obvious that this group of men in black were experts. Who knew how many times they had set the place on fire in the past? What was strange was that although the commotion was so big that night, other than the inside and outside of the tavern, the other places in Qingshitang village were still quiet. There seemed to be no signs of the villagers being alarmed. At the same time, in the small tavern that was gradually engulfed by the raging flames, two black-clothed men had already rushed in. They dragged out the dispirited and pitiful old horse and threw it on the empty ground in front of the tavern. The young man walked over with a solemn expression. It seemed that at this time, due to all kinds of accidents, he finally couldn't maintain that indifferent expression. He said solemnly, "Fatty, I respect you as a man, but you have seen the situation now. I will give you one last chance. Tell me the identity of that shadow and where he is now. Otherwise you will." He gave a look to his side, and the two men in black who caught the old horse pulled out their shining blades at the same time. The man on the right moved slightly faster, and directly placed the blade on the fat man's thick neck. The man on the other side was a step slower, and after a moment of hesitation he put away his blade and took a step back, standing among the crowd. As the cold blade was placed on Old Ma's neck, Old Ma couldn't help but shrink back. His face was pale. It was obvious that he was still nervous. He couldn't help but raise his head to look at the man in black. Perhaps it was an instinctive reaction at the moment of life and death. His body trembled violently. Then he stared at the man in black who was about to kill him. It was as if he wanted to remember the murderer's face and turn into a ghost to take revenge. Unfortunately, this black-clothed man's entire body was wrapped tightly. Even his face was covered by a black cloth, revealing only a pair of eyes. Old Ma glared fiercely at the man in black. The man in black was unmoved. The young man on the other side seemed to have run out of patience. He said coldly, "Have you made up your mind?" He paused for a moment and snorted. He waved his hand and said, "Do it, don't." Suddenly a scream came. It was Old Ma, the fat man, who suddenly shouted. In an instant, his original iron-blooded and unyielding temperament disappeared. He suddenly changed into a depressed and flattering look. He shouted loudly, "I'll talk. I'll talk." Who? There was a commotion among the men in black, including the young man, who seemed to be caught off guard. He was stunned for a moment and couldn't react for a while. The man in black standing next to the fat Old Ma seemed to be more frightened. He staggered and almost fell. Then he seemed to be very angry. He lifted his foot and kicked the fat man. Ouch. Old Ma rolled on the ground twice. He looked like a lump of fat meat. He grimaced for a moment. The young man on the other side came to his senses. He hurriedly stopped the man in black who seemed to want to beat the fat man. He walked quickly to the side of Old Ma and said seriously, "Ma Xiaoyan." As soon as he said that, even he himself frowned. He felt that the name was too different from the fat man in front of him. However, according to the secret report from Zheng Xianmeng and Fiyunji, this person did have this name. But at this moment he couldn't care so much. He took a deep breath and said, "Ma Xiaoyan, listen. My name is Shang Fei. I'm the deputy lord of the West Altar of the Three Realms Divine Sect. As long as you tell me the truth, I guarantee that you won't have to worry about Fiyunji for the rest of your life." Ma Xiaoyan? The fat Old Ma nodded and said, Thank you. You must save me." Shang Fei nodded. There was some anticipation and nervousness in his eyes. He said, "Tell me quickly. Who is the shadow hiding here?" There was silence, and all the men in black subconsciously held their breaths as they listened. The night breeze blew past, and only the crackling sound of the fire burning on the tavern's roof could be heard. In an even more distant place, in the depths of the thick darkness, a faint and indistinct sound could be heard, as if someone's water buffalo had finally been startled, letting out a mooing sound. Old Ma gritted his teeth. It seemed that he had gone through the last struggle in his heart. He even looked back at the man in black who was holding the knife. It seemed that he was very afraid of the knife. After a moment he said, "I don't know the original name of the shadow. But when I picked him up, his name was Lu Qin. He is 28 years old this year and has a medium build." Shang Fei raised his eyebrows and nodded slightly. Obviously he seemed to know the basic information of the shadow. It also proved that the fat man in front of him had indeed told him everything. He said, "Well said. What else?" The fat man hesitated for a moment. The man in black standing next to him seemed to despise this fickle villain very much. With a low shout, he placed the knife on Old Ma's neck and shouted, "Speak quickly." Chapter 53. Old Ma shrank back and looked frightened. He stammered, I'll tell you. I heard that Lu Qin came from the chopping wood pavilion. He was talented, but arrogant and conceited since he was a child. What's more, it was said that he was very lustful. He fell in love with the only daughter of the chopping wood pavilion's master during his cultivation, and then they became lovers. Later, when the matter was exposed, the chopping wood pavilion's master was furious and wanted to kill him. The scum went all the way. He even falsely accused the chopping wood pavilion to Zhang Xianmeng of colluding with the devil cult. No, the divine cult, which attracted the masters of the heavenly law hall of the immortal allies to fight with him. In the intense battle, this person was heavily injured and his cultivation was crippled. But because some important people in the Celestial Alliance wanted to save face, they protected him. After that, he was transferred to the Floating Cloud Agency and became a lazy shadow that was just waiting to die. But even here, this person still doesn't do his job properly. All day long, he seduces women and harms them. He has a bad reputation in this village. As Shang Fei listened, he slowly frowned and looked a little disappointed. But then he couldn't help but snort coldly and said, Is this person so despicable? Old Ma nodded repeatedly and said, Yes, this guy is so bad. There is no good part of him. Moo. Shang Fei seemed to want to say something more, but from somewhere in the darkness, there suddenly came a cow's moo, and this time it sounded a lot clearer. Shang Fei was stunned, and there seemed to be a little surprise on his face. He suddenly turned around and looked into the darkness. It was deep in the night and the darkness was like ink. He stared at the darkness and the expression on his face changed. Suddenly, his face changed dramatically, as if he suddenly felt something at this moment. He shouted, Not good, run. This shout came so abruptly that none of the black-clothed men around could react for a moment. Instead, the tied-up old Ma and the black-clothed man standing beside old Ma with a sharp blade in his hand raised their heads and glanced at somewhere in the darkness at the same time. Suddenly, a pair of giant eyes appeared in the ink-like darkness. Each eye was as tall as a person. Although the body of the monster could not be seen due to the darkness, one could imagine just how terrifying the monster in the darkness was just by looking at the pair of eyes. This part of the world, this part of the night, also seemed to suddenly freeze. Everything was still, not even the wind could move. A moment later, in the darkness, from the direction of the terrifying giant eye, an unimaginable howl suddenly rang out. Moo. That was the third cow's moo that night, but it was far more terrifying than the previous 2 times. A violent breath instantly condensed in the darkness in front, and then rushed over like a surging river. In an instant, it covered the sky and the earth, shrouding the entire village. The darkness was like a real thing, like a violent giant rushing forward, suddenly strangling everyone in the field. All of the black-clothed men screamed in an instant and covered their ears. Those with weaker cultivation could not even stand steadily. In the crowd, in this sudden attack, only 3 people remained calm. Shang Fei was one of them, but he did not seem to be in a good state either. This violent roar seemed to be mixed with incredible power, and it directly caused a dark red line of blood to flow down from the corner of his mouth. In the blink of an eye, Shang Fei was shocked to find that not far away, the fat man on the ground and the black-clothed man holding the knife standing beside the fat man did not seem to feel anything, as if they were injured or had any reaction. At this moment, an extremely absurd feeling welled up in his heart, but with life and death in front of him, how could he care so much? He felt that the roar did not seem to be affected at all, and it was even getting fiercer. The darkness in front of him seemed to be boiling, and it was about to press down, as if the sky was about to collapse. Shang Fei screamed, his voice was sharp and he leaped up. Then, a yellow light suddenly flashed on his body, and a palm-sized wooden figure that was very similar to him suddenly flew up and blocked in front of him. At the same time, there was a loud roar in the darkness, like a surging tide. Those black-clothed men on the ground who were holding their heads and screaming with all their might, except for the one standing beside old Ma, suddenly froze, and then a terrifying scene appeared. All the black-clothed men's bodies suddenly exploded in an instant, and countless blood turned into a blood mist that sprayed into the night sky, forming an incomparably mournful scene from hell. Almost at the same time, the wooden figure that Shang Fei released seemed to be hit by a huge force, and with a bang the figure instantly exploded and turned into smoke, turning into countless pieces that scattered in all directions. In midair, Shang Fei screamed, but it stopped abruptly as if he had suffered a heavy blow. At that moment, he did not dare to stay any longer, and directly turned into a white shadow, desperately flew away, and disappeared into the depths of the distant darkness in the blink of an eye. The terrifying and strange roar gradually subsided, and the strange scene in the night sky also disappeared. The remains of those black-clothed men fell to the ground, and the dark red blood mist rushed into mid-air, and then gradually turned into a mournful blood rain, slowly falling down. Unknowingly, there were only 2 people left in this scene. Old Ma looked up at the black-clothed man standing beside him, and the black-clothed man lowered his head to look at Old Ma. For a long time the two actually did not speak. It was not known whether it was because they were too shocked or because of other reasons. After another moment, Old Ma's body suddenly tilted, and he suddenly gasped as if he had touched a certain injury. For a moment he was annoyed and angrily scolded, "Fuck you, come over and untie me." The black-clothed man snorted, raised his hand and chopped down at Old Ma. Old Ma shrank his head and felt a chill on his body. The blade cut dangerously in front of him, and then he felt his hands and feet loosened and the rope was cut. Then the black-clothed man threw away the blade in his hand, and took off the black mask on his face, revealing his face. Impressively, it was Lu Qin. Old Ma's injury was not light, lying on the ground for a while, and he could not stand up for a while. Then he angrily looked at Lu Qin and spat, "They can't even kill a person with no cultivation, what a waste." Lu Qin shrugged, looked at Old Ma and said, "After so many cuts, you are still not dead. God is really blind. Get out." Hiss. A painful hum came out of Old Ma's mouth, and he slowly sat up with the help of Lu Qin. Chapter 54. Then Lu Qin found some medicine from God knows where and began to treat the wounds of the fat man who was covered in cuts and bruises. Be gentle, be gentle. The fat on Old Ma's fat face twisted and cold sweat dripped from his forehead. He glared at Lu Qin and said through gritted teeth, "You bastard, can't you see that I'm seriously injured? Can't you be gentle?" Lu Qin was silent for a moment, then poured a strange pink powder on his wounds. Old Ma shouted and almost fainted. It took him a long time to recover, gasping for breath. It seemed that he did not even have the strength to scold Lu Qin. Lu Qin looked at him and said calmly, "Black snake powder is a good thing. Although it's a little painful, it can help you recover some of your strength quickly. At least you won't die on the road." The fat man's face was pale. He panted heavily and scolded weakly, "F***ck off. This taste. Why don't you pour it on yourself? When I came back 10 years ago, my body was covered in this," Lu Qin said. The fat man's whole body trembled as if he was scared. He looked at Lu Qin in a daze and said in surprise, "Really?" Lu Qin did not answer him, only silently bandaging his wounds. It seemed that the fat man Old Ma was shocked by the careless and flat words. After that, the fat man Old Ma did not say any more nonsense. When the two of them were bandaging their wounds in the fire and among the corpses around them, suddenly there was a sound of footsteps coming from the front. The two of them looked up and only saw a black shadow slowly walking out from the depths of the darkness. With the help of the fire, the two of them saw that it was actually a cow coming out. An oxen. This oxen looked a little strange. Not only was it very tall, but it also had a pair of horns on its head that were as lustrous as jade. It looked unusually warm, which was quite a rare sight. Oxen walked all the way to Old Ma and Lu Qin, glanced at them, and there seemed to be some disdain in its eyes. Then it mooed. Lu Qin and Old Ma looked at each other. After a while, Lu Qin snorted and said, "This cow is so ugly." The green ox turned its head around. On its huge head, its eyes that were as big as copper bells glared at Lu Qin. Its aura was extremely ferocious and it looked a little annoyed. Lu Qin ignored it. Instead, he helped Old Ma up from the ground and helped him step by step to the side of the oxen. Oxen seemed a little unhappy. Its head shook twice, but it did not avoid it. It still stood in the same place, but its eyes were looking at Lu Qin more and more unfriendly. Lu Qin supported Old Ma's body, and then put the fat man on the back of the oxen like a sack. Then he found a rope on the ground and tied it around Old Ma's body, firmly fixing him on the back of the cow. During the process, Old Ma did not say a word. It was not until Lu Qin was done and took a step back that his fat face showed some worry. He sighed and said, "What are you going to do?" Lu Qin said lightly, "Don't be a busybody." Old Ma shook his head and said in a low voice, "Don't be like this. I'll go back and beg him for you." Lu Qin snorted and said, "He didn't come himself and only asked this stupid cow to come out. Can't you see the meaning of this?" Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "He has his own difficulties. It's not like you don't know. Besides, even if he really comes, there are so many eyes on him. He might not save you but harm you. Lu Chen waved his hand and said indifferently, "Don't talk nonsense. Anyway, I'll wander around by myself. You don't need to worry about me in the future. Otherwise, who knows when he might die in the hands of his own people." Old Ma was speechless. Lu Chen turned around and walked away. He had only taken a few steps when he looked at the oxen again. Oxen also stared at him. The man and the cow looked at each other. Lu Chen curled his lips and said, "No matter how big your eyes are, you're still an ugly cow." The azure ox was enraged. With a moo, it raised one of its hooves and stomped down heavily. Immediately, the surrounding land shook violently. Furthermore, even the burning houses in the distance trembled violently before collapsing with a crash, adding a bit more power to the azure ox. At this moment, the aura of this oxen was like a mountain, making people look up to it. However, for some reason Lu Chen didn't show any fear. He just looked at this oxen. After a while, his eyes gradually became gentle. He then reached out his hand and touched the head of oxen. Oxen stared at him but didn't dodge. Lu Chen rubbed the green ox's head and patted it lightly. Then he turned around and strode away. Very quickly he walked into the darkness and disappeared. No one knew where he went in the end. After watching Lu Chen's figure disappear into the darkness, oxen mooed softly in that direction. Then it turned around and walked in another direction. It left Qingshiteng village, leaving behind a dark and burning house and a messy place. At this moment in the distant night sky, there seemed to be the radiance of a sword flashing, speeding toward them from the direction of South Pine Mountain. The green ox carried the grumbling fat old horse on its back. After walking out of the village, it quickened its pace. Almost in the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the even deeper darkness. This was the era of the immortal Tao. The billions of people in the world only believed in the great Tao of immortals. They didn't know anything about the government or the imperial court. This was especially true in the vast central divine continent. 3,000 years ago, Kunlun and Tianluo were the initiators. In the following 100 years, the three major sects Taiyao, Fengyu and Thousand Extremes joined forces to create Zhengxianmeng. During this period, countless heroes worked hard to expand and strengthen their strength. Until today, Zhengxianmeng had become a colossus that was second to none in the cultivation world of the divine central continent. Zhengxianmeng mediated disputes among the cultivation sects in the world, guided their cultivation, regulated their finances, balanced their forces, pacified the righteous and suppressed evil. More than 1,000 years ago, it led countless cultivators of the central continent to fight the southern barbarians in the chaotic mountains and defeated them. From then on, its reputation soared and it was revered by the world. All cultivation sects took it as a matter of course to enter Zhengxianmeng. They even took pride in being listed on the roll of 10,000 immortals, issued by Zhengxianmeng. In detail, the divine central continent was indeed a land blessed by the heavens. Its vast land was filled with countless paradises and sacred mountains. As a result, countless cultivators and cultivation families were born. Compared to the barren and barren wastelands of the southern border, it was much better. Because of this, the barbarian clans that had lived in the southern border wastelands since ancient times had always coveted the fertile land of the divine central continent. They had tried many times to pass through the chaotic lands to seize the fertile lands, and because of this they had committed countless killings. Even so, the human clan that had lived in the divine central continent for generations had finally defeated the barbarians. In particular, in the bloody battle 1,000 years ago, the barbarian army was almost completely annihilated, and the barbarians were unable to recover from that setback. Finally, the greatest threat to the human clan was completely eliminated. After 1,000 years, there was no longer any need to worry about the southern barbarians. In fact, if it were not for the fact that the land of chaos was too dangerous and the fact that the human tribe was not familiar with the terrain, especially near the edge of the southern wilderness, there was a place called the Spirit-Breaking Sand Sea that occupied a vast area and was extremely strange. As long as the human tribe cultivators entered it, their cultivation and spiritual power would strangely dissipate, thus turning it into a dangerous land that was difficult to pass through. If that was the case, the human tribe's army might have already killed their way into the southern wilderness and completely exterminated the barbarians. In fact, the chaotic lands was a vast region that spanned millions of miles across the southern part of the divine central continent. In this mystical and strange land, the originally stable spiritual energy of the 5 elements of heaven and earth was, for some reason, abnormally chaotic. Because of this, it created a geographical terrain that was completely different from other places on the mainland. There were countless living creatures and countless treasures of heaven and earth, most of which were unique to the chaotic lands. In other words, the vast land of the chaotic lands was, in fact, the largest and most valuable treasure trove in the divine central continent's cultivation world. In the autumn of this year, a group of 3 people walked into the small city of Crescent, not far from the border of the chaotic lands. After ordering some wine and resting for a while in the busiest tavern in the city, one of the men found the owner of the tavern and requested that he find a guide who was familiar with the chaotic lands. Guides were very common in the chaotic lands. Because of the complex terrain of the chaotic lands, there were many demonic beasts, and the chaotic spiritual energy of the 5 elements, there were many unimaginable dangers and threats. For many cultivators who came to the chaotic lands for the first time, a guide who was familiar with the terrain could effectively help them avoid many unnecessary dangers. In fact, many human cultivators who had been to the chaotic lands before would often ask for a local guide when they returned to the chaotic lands, because it could indeed save them a lot of trouble. The owner of the tavern quickly agreed to this request, and in a short time he found a few people for them to choose from. The first was a thin, dark old man with a wrinkled face. He had a pipe in his mouth and he stood there silently as he smoked. The second was a burly middle-aged man with a stocky build. Even his voice sounded very majestic and he looked like a small mountain of flesh. The third person seemed to be a young man in his 20s. His appearance was ordinary and he had a calm expression. He stood there with a faint and gentle smile on his face as he introduced himself. "My name is Lu Qin, Lu as in land and Qin as in dust." Chapter 55. There were 3 guides, but the group of 2 men and 1 woman clearly did not need so many. Hence, they borrowed a quiet room from the owner of the tavern and chatted with the 3 guides for a while. The dark, skinny old man went in for a while and came out. He squatted by the side and smoked his pipe. He did not say that he wanted to leave, nor did he look happy. It seemed like he was waiting for some result. The burly man went in and came out after a while. He sat down casually and asked the owner of the tavern for a pot of wine. He drank and looked like he was also waiting. Finally, the young man named Lu Qin walked in. The room was not big, but it was really quiet. After closing the door, almost no sound could be heard from outside. There were 2 men and a woman in the room. The leader looked to be a middle-aged man in his 40s, and the 2 people beside him were the man who looked to be in his early 20s. He was quite handsome, and when he looked at Lu Qin, there was a hint of arrogance in the depths of his eyes. The last person was a young girl who looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. She had fair skin, black eyebrows and a jade-like nose. She was very beautiful and she was looking at Lu Qin curiously. She seemed a little surprised that someone so young could become a guide in such a dangerous place. Seeing Lu Qin come in, the middle-aged man smiled at him and said, "Brother Lu, please take a seat." Lu Qin smiled and nodded. He sat down on the empty stool in the room. The middle-aged man did not waste any time and asked directly, "We are going to the disorienting lands to find a spiritual material called the dusk mist flower. Has Brother Lu heard of it? Can you lead us to it?" Lu Qin lowered his eyes and seemed to ponder for a moment. He then looked at the 3 people again and finally at the middle-aged man. He smiled and said, 200 spirit stones. What? Although the middle-aged man seemed to be quite restrained, his expression changed when he heard this number, revealing a look of astonishment. The 2 young men behind him were shocked at first, then angry. The young man was so angry that he stood up, pointed at Lu Qin and said angrily, "How dare you? You bastard, do you think we are stupid and want to extort money from us? Those 2 just now only asked us for 50 spirit stones at most." Little he. The one who shouted to stop was the middle-aged man. He seemed to be able to keep his composure, but his expression was also very ugly at this moment. He looked coldly at Lu Qin and said, "What my martial nephew said just now is the truth. Brother, you opened your mouth with such a high price. Could it be that you are really here to make fun of us?" As he finished speaking, his brows furrowed, and there was a faint aura of might on his face. Lu Qin didn't show any signs of fear because of the anger of these people in front of him. His expression was still calm. At the same time he leaned forward a little, got closer to the middle-aged man and said softly, "Do you want a 1-stripe or a 2-stripe one?" The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and his expression changed. He seemed to have a whole new level of respect for the young man in front of him. At the same time his eyes lit up and he said, You actually know about this 2-striped dusk mist flower?" Lu Qin smiled and didn't say anything. He just nodded. There were countless spirit materials and treasures in the world, and they all had different effects and grades. In the cultivation world, the grade and value of a spirit material was usually determined by the number of spirit inscriptions it could condense and manifest. A spirit material with 1 spirit inscription was a 1-striped spirit material, and 2 spirit inscriptions was a 2-striped spirit material, and so on. The more spirit inscriptions a spirit material had, the higher its grade and value. In fact, a 2-striped spirit material with an extra spirit inscription was often worth dozens of times more than a 1-striped spirit material. In the vast central divine region, almost all spirit materials were strictly classified under this system. However, there was a strange and miraculous place in the world, and that was the land of confusion, where the 5 elements were inverted and chaotic. For some strange reason, among the countless spirit materials in the land of confusion, an extremely small portion of them would suddenly undergo a strange change, and the number of spirit inscriptions they contained would inexplicably increase. Of course, this kind of situation was extremely rare. Even if it wasn't seen in 100 years, it was something that ordinary people could only hope for. However, over the years, the cultivation world of the human race had discovered that these spirit materials that suddenly mutated in the land of confusion not only greatly increased their grade and spiritual power, but also contained some special effects. Not only were they greatly beneficial to the cultivation of immortality, but they could also sometimes produce unexpected surprises when refining immortal pills and spirit medicines. As a result, this kind of mutated spirit material had always been highly valued in the cultivation world, and its value had always been high. However, among the countless spirit materials in the land of confusion, only an extremely small portion of them could mutate. Due to various selfish reasons, no one had ever discovered this kind of spirit material. Famous sects and large sects would always keep it a secret, and lone cultivators would either consume it themselves or secretly sell it. Very few of them were willing to publicize their discovery. As a result, to this day, there were actually only a dozen or so spirit materials that could mutate. The other mutated spirit materials were only known by a small circle of people. The dusk mist flower was one of the latter, a spirit material that was not well known and could mutate. "Yes, I know," replied Lu Qin as if he was talking about something that couldn't be more ordinary. The 3 people sitting in front of him looked at each other with different expressions. The young and beautiful girl looked excited and surprised, while the man called Xiaohe frowned. When he looked at Lu Qin, there was a hint of wariness in his eyes, as if he didn't completely trust him. The middle-aged man, who was the leader, pondered for a moment, then said to Lu Qin, "Brother Lu is very knowledgeable and admirable. To tell you the truth, it would be best if the 3 of you could find a mutated 2-striped dusk mist flower. However, this kind of thing can only be found by luck. We can only ask a guide to bring us to the land of confusion to find where the dusk mist flower grows, and then we can try our luck one by one. Brother Lu, although you are very knowledgeable, if you want to pay 4 or 5 times more than the other 2 just because of this, then we really can't." "What if I promise to bring you to the 2-striped dusk mist flower?" asked Lu Qin. "What, you can really find it?" This time it was the pretty girl who blurted out. Seeing the joy on her face, she couldn't help but stand up. Lu Qin smiled at her, then said to the middle-aged man, "In the market, a mutated spirit material is worth at least 1 grade higher than a spirit material. In other words, a 2-striped dusk mist flower is equivalent to a 3-striped dusk mist flower, and its rarity is much higher. So, 200 spirit stones isn't that high, is it?" The middle-aged man was silent, but Xiaohe, who was behind him, snorted and said, "You're right, but how can you guarantee that you can find such a rare 2-striped dusk mist flower?" Lu Qin shrugged and didn't argue with Xiaohe. He only raised 2 fingers to the middle-aged man and said, 200 spirit stones. "All right." Then, as if remembering something, he added, "I only care about bringing you to find this thing. As for how to pick it, store it, or if we encounter demonic beasts or poisonous creatures along the way, or if other cultivators try to rob us of it, I don't care." Chapter 56. After stating his conditions, Lu Qin left the room and waited in the tavern like the 2 people in front of him. After discussing behind closed doors for a while, the 3 of them walked out of the small house. The middle-aged man in the lead walked directly in front of Lu Qin and said, "Pay half first, and then pay the other half after we find the item." Lu Qin raised his head, smiled at him and nodded. Coming out from the south gate of the Crescent City, they walked along the road that could barely be considered flat but was overgrown with weeds. They could see many pedestrians on the road as well as the two mountain peaks in front of them that looked like screens. The road extended forward and it seemed to lead to the foot of the mountain. Lu Qin and the three employers that had already been introduced to each other were walking on the road. The middle-aged man in the lead was called Han Nanzu, the young man was called He Gang, and the last beautiful woman was surnamed Yi with a single name, Xin. However, their self-introductions were limited to this. They did not mention a single word about their background, and it was hard to say whether these names were real or fake. However, Lu Qin didn't mind this at all. In a place like the disorientated land where good and bad people mixed together and danger lurked in every corner, everyone had to be cautious. Moreover, Han Nanzu and the others didn't try to get to the bottom of Lu Qin's identity and origins. Perhaps they also knew that they wouldn't be able to learn much from Lu Qin. After walking for a while, Lu Qin pointed at the two mountains in front of them and smiled at the three people beside him. The two mountains in front of us, the one on the left is called Tiger Mountain, and the one on the right is called Dragon Mountain. There is a canyon between the two mountains, commonly known as One Line of Sky, and also known as Leaping Tiger Gorge. It is said that a long time ago, someone saw a fierce tiger jumping from this mountain to that mountain, hence the name. Could it be that there are really fierce tigers on this Tiger Mountain? The one who said this was Xin with a curious expression. Lu Qin smiled without saying a word, but He Gang snorted and said, "Junior sister, these are just wild rumors, how can you take them seriously?" Xin's face turned red and she made an "oh" sound, looking a little embarrassed. Lu Qin pretended that he didn't see anything as he smiled and said, "Once we pass through the Leaping Tiger Gorge, we will be considered to have entered the land of chaos. Although there won't be much danger in the beginning, the deeper we go, the more chaotic the five-elemental spiritual energy will be. The various demonic beasts will also become more ferocious and powerful, so everyone should be careful." Han Nanzu nodded slightly, but before he could speak, He Gang calmly said, "It's just the outer regions of the chaotic lands. If there are any dangers, we will naturally deal with them. Since your cultivation is low, don't drag the three of us down. Senior brother." Xin called out to He Gang, as if she felt that his words were a little unpleasant. Han Nanzu, who was walking in front, also frowned slightly. Lu Qin didn't seem to be angry but instead smiled and said, "Brother, he is right. In terms of cultivation, I can't compare to the three of you. I barely have the ability to protect my life. If I encounter any danger in the future, I will try my best to hide and not cause trouble for the three of you. However, if we encounter any danger that is difficult to deal with, we can only ask for Brother He's help when the time comes." Hearing Lu Qin's humble words, He Gang's expression immediately eased up and he said with a slightly proud expression, "Of course, we still need to rely on you to find the two-striped dusk fog flower." Lu Qin laughed and cupped his hands, "Then I will thank Brother He in advance." He Gang smiled and didn't reply, only walking forward with his hands clasped behind his back. At the side, Han Nanzu saw this scene and frowned. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he shook his head and remained silent. The four of them walked for about half an hour and finally arrived in front of the Leaping Tiger Gorge that Lu Qin had mentioned. Standing at the foot of the Green Mountain, they suddenly felt that the surrounding trees were dense and the temperature seemed to have dropped significantly. A gorge passed through two mountains with only one winding mountain path winding around the gorge. The widest part of the path seemed to be only 6 or 7 feet wide. At this moment, the Leaping Tiger Gorge wasn't empty. Although it wasn't as lively as the Crescent City, there were still some people coming and going. From their appearance and clothing, they seemed to be cultivators. However, apart from those who were traveling with them, when they passed by or approached someone else, those cultivators' eyes would reveal a very obvious vigilance and vigilance. Needless to say, the cultivators walking in the Leaping Tiger Gorge were those who planned to explore the disorienting lands, or those who had already explored and returned. Under Lu Qin's lead, Han Nanzu and the others also entered the Leaping Tiger Gorge. Once they entered the gorge, they saw that the surrounding scenery had changed once again. On both sides of the gorge there were towering rocks, old trees and ancient vines everywhere. From time to time, there would be grotesquely shaped rocks jutting out of the gorge. In addition to the occasional appearance of a mountain spring, the mossy water converged to form a stream, giving the place a sense of a different scenery with each step. As for Xin, it seemed like this was the first time she had come to the disorienting lands. She looked at the scenery in front of her with admiration, occasionally exclaiming in surprise when she saw one or two unique sceneries. She seemed to still have a childlike innocence, making the journey a bit more lively. The Leaping Tiger Gorge was rugged and narrow, but the entire journey was uneventful. An hour later they arrived at the entrance of the gorge. At the end of the path was a large stone with the word "Disorienting Lands" engraved on it. The four of them stopped next to the large stone. Han Nanzu and the others looked at each other with solemn expressions. Once they passed through this stone, they would officially enter the Disorienting Lands. For many years this place had always been known for its dangers. Since ancient times, it had devoured the lives of countless cultivators. It could be said to be an ominous place. In comparison, Lu Chen appeared calm and relaxed. He walked over to the stone and lightly patted it. Then he smiled at Han Nanzu and the others before walking past the stone. Han Nanzu and the others quickly followed. As soon as they walked out of the Leaping Tiger Gorge, Han Nanzu and the others suddenly felt a strange and inexplicable feeling sweep past their bodies. It was like an invisible breeze, causing the spiritual energy in their Dantian's Qi to tremble for no reason. But after carefully sensing it, they discovered that there wasn't much of a difference. Lu Chen said, "We have only just entered the Disorienting Lands, so the 5 elements of chaos are not obvious. At the very least, within 1,000 miles of the Disorienting Lands, there is no effect on the cultivation of human cultivators. There is no need to panic." Han Nanzu nodded with a calm expression. It seemed that he had some experience in the Disorienting Lands. He said, "Many thanks for Brother Lu's reminder. What do we plan to do next?" Lu Chen said, "The dusk mist flower that you are looking for can be found in the Black Armor Mountain about 150 miles to the southwest. However, the road is difficult to traverse and there should be some obstacles along the way. It will take about a day or two to get there." Han Nanzu nodded. "Since that is the case, then we should hurry." Lu Chen agreed with a smile and led the way forward. At the same time he raised his head to look at the sky. In this late autumn season the sky was clear and blue. The world was tranquil and there were even a few white clouds slowly drifting by. High up in the sky, far away from the sight of these 4 people, a layer of white clouds floated like silk. A few rays of sword light suddenly shot out from the layer of clouds, streaked across the horizon, and flew towards the depths of the land of chaos. Chapter 57. The land of chaos was extremely vast, spanning over 1,000,000 miles. It was filled with countless dangers and countless lives had been lost there since ancient times. However, the lessons learned through blood and tears were not without value. Today, the cultivation world of the divine central continent had a general understanding of this vast and mysterious and chaotic land. Roughly speaking, the land of chaos could be divided into 3 parts. From the northernmost boundary to the south, it extended for hundreds of thousands of miles to the great river, Dragon River. This was the outer boundary of the land of chaos. Beyond the Dragon River, one would continue for hundreds of thousands of miles to the south until they reached the unreachable Great Snowy Mountain. This was the central part of the land of chaos. Further south was the core of the land of chaos, but it was also the most dangerous region. Countless dangerous places and terrifying creatures resided in this place known as the Abyss of Chaos, including the spirit-shattering sand sea that human cultivators feared. Generally speaking, the deeper one ventured into the land of chaos, the more chaotic the 5 elements would be, and the more dangerous the various dangers would be. Even though there was no publicly acknowledged boundary, there was a kind of secret consensus in the cultivation world of the Central Plains. That was, most of the cultivators who came to the land of chaos were only active in the outer boundary of the land of chaos. As for the wider central region, the degree of danger there was such that only cultivators at the Jindan stage or above were qualified to go there. As for the core of the land of chaos, the Abyss of Chaos was so dangerous that it was said that even spiritual master Yuanying did not dare to set foot there. It could be said to be the most dangerous place in the world. The Black Armor Mountain that Lu Chen was leading Han Nanzu and the others to was only near the border of the land of chaos. It was only a few hundred miles deep into the land of chaos. In a place like this, the spiritual energy of the 5 elements in the land of chaos was not very chaotic. For most human cultivators who came here, they would at most feel a slight obstruction in the circulation of their spiritual energy. Apart from that, they were almost negligible. Along the way, Lu Chen and Han Nanzu were fine, but He Gang and Exan were on high alert. They kept a close eye on their surroundings, afraid that some ferocious and powerful demon beast would jump out of the bushes and bushes beside them if they were not careful. However, as the sky darkened, they had covered about half the distance. In the end, apart from a wandering lynx demon beast, they encountered no other dangers. Even that lynx, which did not seem to be a powerful demon beast, was cut in half by He Gang's sword. In the evening, Lu Chen brought them to the foot of a mountain. After turning left and right, they found a large boulder and circled around it. To their surprise, a dry cave was revealed. He turned around and smiled at Han Nanzu and the others, saying, "Let's sleep here tonight." After entering the cave to tidy up and settle down, Exin, who had been on high alert for the entire day, felt as though she had used all her strength to strike empty air. She couldn't help but ask Han Nanzu, "Senior Uncle Han, didn't they say that the disorienting lands is filled with demonic beasts, poisonous creatures and all kinds of unimaginable dangers? Why haven't we encountered anything on our way here? I don't think it's any different from outside the disorienting lands." Han Nanzu glared at her and snappily said, "You've never seen the world, don't talk nonsense." After saying that, he turned to look at Lu Chen and said seriously, "I didn't expect Brother Lu to be so familiar with the terrain of this area. If it's still the same tomorrow, let alone finding the dusk mist flower, just the fact that you've brought us along this part of the road is worth the price." Lu Chen smiled and said, "You flatter me." At this moment Gang, who was sitting to the side, showed a trace of dissatisfaction on his face. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end he didn't say anything. Lu Chen saw Gang's expression from the corner of his eye, but he didn't take it to heart. He only smiled and said, "In the disorienting lands, it has always been more dangerous at night. Even this area near the edge of the disorienting lands is much more dangerous at night than during the day. However, this place is very safe and there aren't any powerful demonic beasts nearby. After resting here for the night, we'll continue our journey tomorrow." Han Nanzu nodded and said, "I'll listen to you." In the blink of an eye, it was already late at night. Darkness pervaded the outside, but this night, there was a bright moon hanging high in the sky. The cold moonlight spilled over the mountains and fields. The night wind blew gently, rustling the branches of the trees. There was also the sound of insects chirping. No one knew where it came from, but it was intermittent. In the cave, the two youths were already asleep. Lu Chen leaned against the wall, his gaze falling on Han Nanzu. He saw that Han Nanzu's eyes were closed, but both his hands were placed on the sheath of his sword. It seemed that if there was even the slightest sound, he would immediately wake up and draw his sword to meet the enemy. Lu Chen glanced at the sheathed sword and then closed his eyes as well. At this moment, the chirping of the insects outside the cave suddenly quieted down. A gust of cold night wind blew past, bringing with it a slight chill. Lu Chen slowly opened his eyes. In order to avoid attracting demonic beasts, there was no fire in the cave, so most of the place was dark. However, in the shadows, Lu Chen's eyes seemed especially bright. The wind outside the cave was faintly blowing and there seemed to be some strange noises coming from the depths of the forest in the distance. However, it could not be heard clearly, or perhaps it was just an illusion of the dead of night. However, Lu Chen quietly stood up and the shadows around him flowed like water. Almost in an instant, they blended into one with him and even his shadow disappeared, becoming a part of the darkness. He followed the shadows and walked out of the cave without a sound. In the cave, Han Nanzu was still sleeping with his eyes closed. Gang and Exan were completely unaware. The moonlight was cold, and after being blocked by the nearby trees, a beam of light fell on the side of the cave. Lu Chen stood at the entrance of the cave for a moment. His gaze was calm as he slowly looked around. Finally, his gaze fell on the southwest direction. There was a forest over there. In the darkness of the night, the trees were like tall guards and the thick shadows were like cold and gloomy ghosts, appearing somewhat gloomy and terrifying. Lu Chen did not hesitate too much and directly walked into the forest. The darkness wrapped around him, as if he had instantly blended into the gloomy forest. It was as if he was born to belong to the darkness and the shadows were innate. The forest was silent, but as he gradually went deeper, the darkness fluctuated and suddenly there was a roar. The surrounding darkness suddenly trembled violently and a huge figure instantly rushed out from the darkness, letting out an earth-shattering roar. The roar tore apart the silence of the entire forest. It was as if all the darkness had suddenly tightened in an instant and a fierce wind suddenly rushed over. In the darkness, the dense stench of fangs emitted a palpitating light. In the blink of an eye, it was already in front of him and a huge sharp claw slashed down. Roar! That was a bloodthirsty roar. In the midst of the crazy roar, Lu Chen did not dodge. Only his eyes slightly narrowed. Ding! Suddenly, a crisp sound suddenly sounded. Although soft, it was loud and clear, instantly suppressing all the roars and roars. A sword light rushed out from the depths of the darkness. In the blink of an eye, the light was dazzling, like the bright moon in the night sky had fallen into the human world, blooming with a dazzling brilliance that could not be looked at directly. The sword light was like water, its momentum like a flood, piercing the darkness and cutting open the shadows. The huge figure roared and turned back, but suddenly became silent. Then the darkness was split into two halves by this sword light. The smell of blood instantly filled the air. In the darkness there was a rain of blood. Everything seemed to have stopped in an instant. Only that stunning and cold sword light was still moving forward in the darkness, piercing through the shadows. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of Lu Qin. It was unstoppable and did not seem to stop. Chapter 58. Lu Qin took a step back, looking as if he had been frightened. His face was tense, and he had one hand in front of his chest while the other hung by his side. Then he quietly reached behind him in the shadows, as if he had grabbed something in the dark. At that moment, the sword light was like a bright moon, its splendor illuminating the entire forest. The wind howled like a surging torrent, but in the next moment the sword blade in the light suddenly stopped inches in front of Lu Qin. The sword light that filled the sky sprinkled down like a shower of stars, gradually converging, and finally quietly converging into the long sword that was as bright as autumn water. Darkness swarmed over, drowning the figure opposite him in the same shadow. It was vaguely a woman. Her face could not be seen clearly, the only light in the dark forest was the sword in her hand. The wind rose again in the forest, faintly blowing past. The pattering from the sky was dark red blood. A drop of blood landed on the tip of the sword, gently trembling, with a soul-stirring and strange beauty. Lu Qin felt a chill between his brows, as if an invisible sword had already stabbed down in that instant. That sword stopped in front of him, silently in the darkness. "Why didn't you dodge?" A calm but pleasant female voice came from the shadows in front of them. Lu Qin took a deep breath, said, "Your skills are too high, the sword force is too fast, I can't dodge." The woman in the darkness snorted, said, "Since it is so, why are you secretly holding a weapon behind your back? What is your intention?" Lu Qin immediately raised his right hand that was hanging by his side. Without any hesitation, he threw out the black short sword that he was holding in his hand. After a while there was a muffled "pew" sound. The black sword was stabbed into a nearby tree trunk. Lu Qin spread out his hands indicating that he was unarmed, and then slowly put them down. That bright long sword still stopped in front of him, did not waver in the slightest, and also did not have any intention of withdrawing. The night wind blew, that drop of blood on the sword tip trembled and twisted a few times, suddenly split into two, quietly drifting from the two sides of the blade to the dark ground. In that instant the long sword's light seemed to brighten a little, the sharp sword tip also seemed to slightly raise its head. The surroundings were silent, in the depths of Lu Qin's eyes, his pupils also slightly contracted. But that instant passed in the blink of an eye, the long sword suddenly retreated, silently submerged into the darkness, returned to the woman's side and then disappeared. There was a bit of light in the shadows as if it was her bright and clear eyes. She glanced at Lu Qin without saying anything, turned and left, disappearing into the darkness in the blink of an eye. And at the moment when she turned, the darkness surged. Suddenly there seemed to be a faint red light flickering in the shadows. Lu Qin saw that moment of light, although it was a bit blurry, but he still saw that the woman's shoulder was draped with a scarlet feather shawl. Like the wings of a bird, it spread out behind her in the night, soaring in the night, floating into the distance. Lu Qin stood in place for a while, his eyebrows gradually wrinkled as if thinking about something. After a while he walked to the side of the tree trunk and took back the black short sword. It was unknown what movement his hand made, but after a slight tremble in the darkness, the black sword disappeared. Then Lu Qin took a few steps forward and then half squatted down. The surrounding smell of blood began to diffuse, and blood dyed the ground in the forest red. Not far away, a terrible demon beast's body was split into two and fell to the ground. "Black demon bear," Lu Qin said in a low voice, then walked over and fiddled with the remains of the demon beast with his feet. "The demon core is gone, it should have been taken away by her. That sword was so powerful, it should be Moonlight Chop?" He was silent for a moment, then stood up, looked into the depths of the darkness in the distance, and said to himself in a low voice, "When did the Kunlun party have such a powerful young genius? But about that shawl." Lu Qin paused, shook his head and said nothing, then turned around and walked back the way he came. Just for a moment the darkness followed him like a shadow, and in the blink of an eye he also disappeared into the shadows. The next morning after Han Nanzu and the others woke up, The group of four continued on their journey to the Black Armor Mountain. Perhaps it was because they were gradually entering the depths of the disorienting lands, they encountered more demon beasts today than yesterday. But under Lu Chen's lead, they still avoided most of the dangers along the way, and after half a day they finally saw the peak of the Black Armor Mountain. Because it was almost impossible for ordinary people to enter the disorienting lands, most of the people who came here were human cultivators. Therefore, there were many places in the wilderness where there were no people and of course there were no roads. But there were exceptions to everything. For example, some popular places human cultivators would come here many times, and some roads would appear after they stepped on it. For example, Lu Chen's group of four was currently standing on a small hill, and there was a three-way fork in the road. Lu Chen pointed in the southwest direction and said to Han Nanzu and the others, "If we go in this direction, we will reach the Black Armor Mountain in an hour at most." Han Nanzu nodded, and looked at the seemingly inconspicuous mountain in the distance. A trace of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Standing to the side, EXN looked around curiously, and finally her gaze fell on the road under her feet, and she asked Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, did you say that this road was formed by many people?" Lu Chen said, "Yes." EXN said, "Could it be that everyone is going to the Black Armor Mountain? Doesn't that mean that all the spiritual materials on the mountain have been collected by people?" Lu Chen said with a smile, "That's not it. Although there are evening fog flowers and some other spiritual materials on the Black Armor Mountain, they are almost the lowest grade of one-mark spiritual materials, so they can't attract too many people. The cultivators who often walk here go to another place." Another place? EXIN's gaze drifted to another intersection, where the road meandered forward, leading to the southeast. "What is that over there? Is there any good place to go?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "Hundreds of miles south from here, there are quite a few famous spiritual material production areas, such as Green Sunflower Cave, Five Peaks Mountain, Yellow Mud Pond. Usually many cultivators go there." "I see." EXN nodded and said with a smile, "Brother Lu, you are really knowledgeable." Lu Chen shrugged and said with a smile, "Don't forget that this is what I do for a living." EXN smiled sweetly, but He Gang looked a little unconvinced and snorted, "In my opinion, although there are several places here, the most famous ones are clearly not those." EXN was stunned for a moment and said, "Senior brother, what do you know?" He Gang said with an arrogant face, "Before coming here, I have done my homework. 800 miles south from here is the battlefield of the righteous and demonic path 10 years ago, which is also the location of the famous Barren Valley. That is the place that countless cultivators want to go to the most. Brother Lu, am I right?" He Gang squinted at Lu Chen. Lu Chen was silent for a moment and then said with a calm face, "Yes." Chapter 59. EXIN's eyes lit up and her face revealed a pleasantly surprised expression. She said, "So the desolate valley is over there? I heard that 10 years ago, the evil cult set up some kind of sinister formation there in an attempt to absorb the blood, flesh and soul of thousands of living beings. As a result, our Zhengxianming sent an army to break through the formation, causing the evil cult to suffer a great loss of vitality. Until now they have not been able to recover." Lu Chen was startled. He looked at EXN with a trace of astonishment on his face. He said, "Set up a formation to absorb the blood and essence of living beings? Where did you hear this?" EXN was about to answer, but He Gang sneered and said, "Junior sister, don't listen to hearsay. In that battle, it was clearly the evil cult's evil people who secretly gathered in the desolate valley and set up the 18 Hell Prison formation. They intended to summon the Yellow Springs evil spirit army to harm the human world. It has nothing to do with living beings or blood." EXN frowned and showed an unconvinced expression. She said, "No. I clearly heard Master talking about this. He said so." As she said this, she turned her head to look at Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu, what do you think? Have you ever heard of what the evil cult did in the desolate valley before?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He revealed a bitter smile and shook his head. "I also don't know." He Gang wanted to say something, but he saw Han Nanzu, who was walking in front, glared at the two of them and said, "What are you talking about? Let's go quickly." He Gang and EXN seemed to have a lot of respect for this martial uncle. Hearing this, they did not dare to say anything more. The group of four continued to walk towards the Black Armor Mountain in the southwest. As for the fork leading to another direction, no one passed by. It was as quiet as before among the weeds. When they walked to the foot of the Black Armor Mountain and began to climb the mountain, the ease of the journey disappeared. Because on the Black Armor Mountain, there were almost demon beasts everywhere. Even with a guide like Lu Qin, it was difficult to find a shortcut. The demonic beasts in the chaotic lands were ferocious creatures. When they saw people passing by, they would often attack. Therefore, Han Nanzu and the others took out their weapons and killed the demonic beasts along the way. Fortunately, this place was not too deep into the disorienting lands. The strength of the demonic beasts on the mountain was only average. They were ferocious but not intelligent. Han Nanzu and the others were able to deal with them. However, halfway up the mountain, He Gang, who had a few drops of blood on his face and body, could no longer endure it. He looked coldly at Lu Qin and said coldly, "Lu Qin, why aren't you attacking?" Along the way, Lu Qin had indeed been watching with folded arms. Strangely, most of the demonic beasts on the mountain were looking for Han Nanzu and the others. Very few of them went to cause trouble for Lu Qin. Lu Qin was also happy to be at ease. He had been watching the battle from the side and had no intention of helping at all. After hearing He Gang's words, Lu Qin grinned and said, "We have an agreement. I only need to lead the way. I don't care about anything else." He Gang was furious, but he was immediately stopped by Han Nanzu. This middle-aged man looked at Lu Qin and frowned. "Brother Lu, since we have promised you, we will not go back on our words. However, now that we have reached the Black Armor Mountain, where is the Dusk Fog Flower?" Lu Qin smiled and took 2 steps forward. Looking at the mountain, he waved his hand and said, "Follow me." The group of 4 continued to move forward. Han Nanzu and the others followed behind Lu Qin. They saw that he was walking towards the east of the Black Armor Mountain. In less than an hour, they encountered several groups of demonic beasts. The others were fine, but when they walked to the side of a mountain stream, they encountered a group of black jackals, which was a bit troublesome. Black jackals were ordinary low-level demonic beasts. They looked similar to the dogs of the farmers in the mountains outside the chaotic lands, except that they were a bit bigger and more ferocious. Individually, even on the Black Armor Mountain, black jackals were a relatively weak kind of demonic beast. However, this kind of demonic beasts were born to be in groups. Almost no black jackals appeared alone. At the same time, this kind of demonic beast was relatively smarter than other demonic beasts. When they encountered prey, they would swarm together, which was not easy to deal with. On the mountain road beside the mountain stream, Lu Qin and the others encountered such a group of black jackals. There were about 7 or 8 of them. In fact, it was not a big group, but even so, these black jackals showed He Gang and Exin what was called cunning. The group of demonic beasts surrounded them from all sides. They even used the strategy of making a sound in the east and attacking in the west. Then they quickly judged that Exin and He Gang were the 2 weakest among them. Suddenly they attacked together, catching the 2 young people off guard. Especially Exin, because she had not been in the Jianghu. When she saw the ferocious and abnormal demonic beasts pouncing on her, she turned pale and could only use 50% of her power. Fortunately, there was Han Nanzu, who had profound cultivation and rich experience on this side. He rushed forward with a sword, killed 3 demonic beasts and wounded 2. Only then did the rest of the demonic beasts retreat and saved Exin, who was a little embarrassed. During this process, Lu Qin still did not make a move. Exin was still in a state of shock, so it was fine, but He Gang was glaring angrily. Just as he was about to let loose a torrent of abuse, he suddenly saw Lu Qin standing on the stone cliff beside the mountain stream, looking down, then beckoning to them. "We're here, the Dusk Fog Flower is right below." Lu Qin's words weren't wrong. When Han Nanzu and the others came over to take a look, they discovered that there was indeed a waterfall that was several meters tall at the bottom of the mountain stream. The water flowed down and converged into a pool, and there were many pink flowers growing on the wet stone walls beside it. This time He Gang couldn't be bothered to argue with Lu Qin anymore. They hurriedly found a path to descend the mountain and walked all the way to the pool. Han Nanzu looked at the stone wall and smiled. "It really is the Dusk Fog Flower. I didn't think there would be so many here." He Gang and Exin were also very happy. Their goal this time was actually to pick 10 Dusk Fog Flowers and return to complete the task. But looking at the flowers on the stone wall, there were at least 20 of them. It was obviously a big harvest. Immediately He Gang and Exin rushed to the stone wall to pick, while Han Nanzu walked to Lu Qin's side and said, "Brother Lu, this place is really good, thank you. But the 2-striped Dusk Fog Flower you mentioned before?" Lu Qin nodded and pointed to the waterfall, saying, "If I'm not wrong, on the stone wall behind the curtain of water, there should be a two-striped dusk fog flower. You should go and take a look. Han Nanzu was startled, and a trace of surprise appeared in his eyes. But after thinking for a moment, he still nodded and walked towards the waterfall. When he came to the side of the waterfall, he quickly climbed up the stone wall. Although many places looked slippery, it did not seem to be a problem for him. Not long after, his figure suddenly stopped, and then he looked into the water, plucked a large red flower from behind the water, and then jumped down. After landing on the ground, Han Nanzu carefully looked at the red flower in his hand, and suddenly a smile appeared on his face. He nodded and said with a smile, "It really is a two-striped dusk fog flower." After thinking for a moment, he directly took out a small bag from his bosom and threw it to Lu Qin. "Your remaining half of the reward." Lu Qin caught it and nodded with a smile. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly frowned and looked back. The wilderness was quiet. Other than the sound of the mountain breeze blowing through the treetops, there was almost no other movement. Just that right now there was something strange in the wind. There seemed to be one or two light long howls and barks coming from afar. Lu Chen's face darkened and he turned around with a frown. He said to Han Nanzu, "Stop picking, let's leave this place." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.